Tonight, as the room grows quiet and the last small sounds of the day begin to soften, settle in gently now and let the hush of tidewater, woven sailcloth, and low amber lanterns carry you toward an older sea, where Sinbad was still young enough to be learning and wise enough to listen. In those earlier years, before his name had gathered the bright weight of famous telling, Sinbad was a merchant's son, not yet 30, broad-shouldered from shipboard labor rather than vanity, and known more for careful eyes than for bold speech. He had already crossed enough water to know that the sea did not care for boasting. He had stood in dawn harbors where ropes steamed faintly after rain, and in moonlit anchorages where every mast seemed a dark reed set into silver. He knew the smell of pepper sacks and wet cedar planks, the pale dust that clung to rolled silk, the cool smoothness of glazed jars wrapped in reed matting, and the different voices that cargo made when a vessel rose and settled against a pier. Clay jars spoke one way, bales of wool another, bundles of paper hardly at all. At that time he was living in Basra, not in luxury, though his father had once been comfortable, and not in hardship either, for he had learned early that a man who understood roots, measures, and temperaments could make a modest prosperity breathe a little farther each season. The river there moved slowly toward the Gulf, broad and reflective, carrying with it the smells of mudbank reeds, tar, dates, fish scales, lamp oil, and distant salt. Barges came and went beneath lateen sails of cream or patched brown. Small ferries crossed under dawn mist. Warehouse doors rolled open with long wooden groans. Porters bent beneath indigo, cumin, carded wool, and brass fittings. Traders argued in shade and counted in murmurs. Scribes sat near scales. Boys ran barefoot with messages wrapped in cloth. At night, when the wind turned kindly, one could hear from the farther quays the tapping of caulkers, finishing some narrow hull by lantern light, or the slow wash of the tide around moored boats, or the call of a sailor, half singing to himself as he coiled rope for morning. Sinbad liked those hours at the edge of day best, when the harbor had not yet become busy enough for vanity, and had not yet grown so weary that every man's patience thinned. He would often walk the river front at first light with a folded list tucked into his sash, checking shipments, speaking with masters, looking at cordage, making note of which hulls had been newly tarred, and which captains were likely to keep their word without needing to be chased across half the quay by noon. He was not reckless in choosing voyages. The sea had already taught him enough to cure him of that. But he was curious, and his curiosity moved in patient ways. He liked neglected routes, forgotten warehouses, old charts annotated in several hands, and the kinds of captains who preferred sound timbers to painted sterns. It was on a windless evening near the beginning of the saffron season, when the air over the river carried both warmth and a faint mineral coolness after sunset, that he first heard of the creatures older than time. He had gone that evening to the upper sailors' quarter, where rope makers, compass repairers, sail stitchers, when dealers in second-use marine goods kept their narrow shops beneath projecting roofs. The lane there climbed gently away from the water and held the day's heat long after dusk. Light from open doorways lay across the ground in pale strips. Copper vessels glimmered. Bundles of flax leaned against walls. Dry herbs for shipboard infusions hung in bunches overhead. The smell of pitch was never absent, yet it mingled pleasantly with cardamom, wool, and river damp. Sinbad was seeking lamp chimneys and spare wick for a small coastal vessel in which he had invested part of a season's profit. And because he had finished his business before the hour of full dark, he stopped, as he sometimes did, at a tea stall kept by an old widow whose cups were always clean, and whose mint never tasted of dust. There were only 3 others there that evening: a sailmaker, half asleep over his bowl, a clerk from the customs quay, rubbing his eyes after a long day, and an elderly man sitting by the lattice window with one hand on a walking staff made of dark, polished wood. The old man's cloak was plain. His beard was white, but not soft. It had the weathered texture of rope, left long at sea and carefully dried again. His face was seamed not in loose folds, but in the fine crossing lines of someone who had squinted toward horizons for most of a lifetime. On the low table before him lay not the prayer beads or folded letters one might expect, but an astrolabe wrapped in linen and 2 narrow slips of stiffened parchment tied with blue thread. Sinbad knew him by sight, as many harbor men did, though few claimed to know him well. His name was Hadi al-Misri, though he had not been Egyptian by birth. Harbor talk said he had learned charts in Aden, pilotage on the Omani coast, and the reading of lesser currents among islands so small they existed only in memory and in a few fading coastal manuscripts. Years earlier, he had served as a navigator on merchant vessels that did not seek the loudest ports. He had favored the in-between places, water stops, reef anchorages, little trade coves where ships took on figs, lime, salt fish, and water rather than fame. He was said to be 82, though his back was so straight when seated that men sometimes guessed younger until they saw him stand. The widow poured Sinbad tea, and with that instinct older women often possess, placed him at the table nearest Hadi, rather than farther off. For a time, no one spoke. The tea steamed. Outside, a donkey passed with little bronze bells at its harness. Somewhere a boy laughed once, and then vanished into distance. The customs clerk finished his bowl and left. The sailmaker nodded over his cup. At length, Hadi turned one of the tied parchment slips between his fingers and said, not looking at Sinbad, "You are Yusuf ibn Rahman's son." Sinbad inclined his head. "I am." "He kept honest accounts. He tried. That is all any account can ask." The old man sipped his tea. His voice was dry but not cold. Sinbad, who had learned not to rush rare conversations, simply waited. Hadi untied the blue thread from one parchment slip, unrolled it upon the table, and smoothed its edges with the flat of his hand. The parchment held a chart drawn in brown ink, faded toward bronze. It showed a section of coast south and east of Basra's more familiar trade runs, though not so far away as India, or the great ocean voyages. It was a coast of islands, shoals, inlets, and pale water notes. Small comments in several scripts ran along its edges. One ink hand recorded soundings. Another named a spring. A third, very small and neat, had drawn 3 tiny lantern marks beside a crescent-shaped harbor, barely larger than a thumbnail. Hadi tapped that place lightly. Have you ever heard of the harbor of Dua's Rest? Sinbad leaned closer. He had a good memory for coastal names, and this one did not ring clearly. No. Few have. Fewer now each year. Sinbad looked again. The harbor sat on a narrow island or spit turned toward a deep basin. Beyond it, the chart showed a darker shape below the waterline. Perhaps a trench, perhaps a channel. A note beside it had been partly abraded away. Only a few words remained. Old basin, warm rise, first swimmers. He lifted his eyes. What is it? Hadi rewrapped the astrolabe cloth around his hand, more from habit than need. A harbor once used by coasters and patient traders. Not a rich port, not a crowded one. A place for water, shelter, lamp oil, rope repair, the exchange of modest goods, and the resting of tired men. The basin near it was known for creatures the sailors there called the first swimmers. Some said they were older than the islands. Some said older than the moon. Sailors say many things, but they were old enough that no one living had seen their kind begin. The widow set more hot water to steep. Sinbad glanced toward the lane, then back to the chart. The harbor is gone? Hadi's hand remained resting beside the parchment, motionless except for one finger that moved slightly, with the beat of the blood. Not gone. Unused, which is not always the same thing. That answer was the sort Sinbad liked. It did not close the matter. It made room. He asked, why was it left? Hadi considered the steam above his cup before replying. Because men grow impatient. Because larger harbors promise louder profit. Because a route requiring care will eventually be abandoned by those who mistake speed for skill. Because a lantern system fails if no one climbs the steps. Because cistern covers crack. Because one season of neglect invites another. Because no one writes down the smaller needs as carefully as the larger revenues. Sinbad let his gaze return to the chart. He could almost see the narrow island in the old ink, the 3 lantern marks, the bent line of the sheltered water. The note about first swimmers pulled at him more quietly than a Marvel tale would have done. Not because it sounded unbelievable, but because it sounded like the kind of old harbor, saying that grew around something observed again and again, until fact and reverence settled into each other like silt in clear water. Hadi rolled the chart halfway closed, then opened it once more, as though debating within himself. I was there when I was younger, he said. 3 times as a working navigator, once more on a slower vessel after I had taken to charts and instruction. The harbor had 3 low shore lamps and 1 higher turning lantern on the point. Not a grand system, but an exact one. The lower lights took ships around the shallows, and the upper lamp reassured them once the entrance narrowed. Traders carried cinnamon, indigo, woven cotton, rose oil, brass cups, ceramic jars, and paper there. They took on sweet water from a stone cistern, dried fish, shell lime, herbs, salt cakes, and once, on one particular season, a saffron so fine it perfumed a whole cabin through closed jars. There was also a custom there. He paused. No nets were cast in the inner basin after moonrise. Because of the creatures? Hadi nodded. They came in with a deeper water and the warm current that lifted through the basin floor. Great old turtles, most believed. Some larger than a skiff. A few might have been something else besides. Their backs broke the surface like dark, patient islands. Their heads rose and lowered. They drifted, breathed, and sank again, harmless, unhurried. The sailors never touched them. The harbor people said the basin belonged to them first, and men were only visitors. The widow, who had heard this part of the old story before, gave a small approving sound and poured more tea into Hadi's cup without asking. "Then why tell me?" Sinbad asked. The old navigator's eyes were clearer than one expected from so weathered a face. "Because you look at ledgers as if they are maps. Because your father once told me that when you were a boy, you preferred the small diagrams in the margin of cargo lists to the sums themselves. Because I am too old to go alone, and too old also to let some routes vanish without one last attempt at remembrance." The lane outside settled more deeply into evening. Lamps were lit behind lattices. A cat passed beneath a bench, and the air cooled a little. Sinbad asked, "What sort of attempt?" Hadi rolled the chart and tied it again. "A vessel is leaving in 6 days for a modest coastal circuit. Not a grand expedition. Dates, saffron, lamp oil, blue cloth, paper, small glazed bowls, coils of rope, resin, and cedar pegs. It will make profit if the winds behave, and if the captain remains faithful to practicality. I have already spoken with him. He would allow a deviation of some days if expenses are shared and the cargo preserved. I wish to go by Duha's rest. I wish to see whether the basin still breathes warm, whether any lamp foundation remains sound, and whether one may yet leave the place kinder than one finds it." He lifted the staff and stood, very slowly, but without trembling. The sailmaker slept on. The widow wiped the edge of the table with a cloth. Hadi tucked the chart into the fold of his cloak. "Think on it," he said. "Do not answer from romance. The sea has no use for romance in quantities large enough to steer by." Then he inclined his head to the widow, stepped into the lane, and was gone among the lamp shadows. For the rest of that night, Sinbad found that the harbor of the old chart would not leave him. It accompanied him across the upper quarter and down toward the river. He crossed under balconies from which hung folded nets and dyed cloth. He passed a yard where 3 boys were rubbing down oars in silence beneath a lantern. He descended to the waterfront, where the river took the city's lights and broke them into wavering strips. There the smell of tar and mud and distant brine met him like a familiar hand. Barges knocked softly together. A moored vessel creaked in its lines. Somewhere farther off, An anchor chain gave a low note against wood. By the time he reached his own lodging, a narrow house above a spice storeroom, he had already begun measuring the proposal the way he measured any voyage, by cargo, by season, by likely delay, by soundness of captain, by the needs he knew, and the needs he might not yet know. Yet beneath all such thought, there moved another current, quieter, but stronger. It was the image of a forgotten harbor not ruined by calamity, but merely dimmed by neglect. That, to him, felt different from disaster. Disaster often leaves men with grief and little else. Neglect leaves, sometimes, a door slightly open for patience. He slept lightly and dreamed not of monsters or storms, but of 3 low lamps, burning one beneath another, on a coast no longer named aloud. The next morning he asked after the vessel. It was called the Quiet Faith, a broad-beamed coastal dhow, built of teak and date palm ribs, with a hull that had once been handsome and remained sturdy. Her captain, Faraj ibn Khalil, was a man of 58 with a measured speaking voice and the habit of touching new rope between finger and thumb before agreeing to any bargain involving movement over water. Faraj did not hurry. His beard was more iron than black. His outer robe was plain. The men who worked under him said he knew how to keep a deck calm, even when wind and tide grew contrary, which was praise of the best sort. He disliked passengers who had no use. He disliked merchants who treated sailors as beasts. He disliked needless detours. And because of these traits, Sinbad liked him at once. The Quiet Faith was lying at a side quay among coasters, not at the louder commercial piers where ostentation sometimes outshone seamanship. When Sinbad arrived, the vessel was loading. Date syrup sealed in clay jars came aboard first, carefully laid with padding between them, then 2 chests of saffron wrapped in waxed cloth, each small enough to be lifted by 2 careful men, but valuable enough to scent the planks around them, even through the wrappings. Bundles of Yemeni paper tied in reeds were stowed, high and dry. Indigo cakes went into a shaded compartment. A narrow crate of glass lamps, each nested in wool, was passed hand to hand with particular gentleness. Coiled rope hung ready near the stern. 2 small casks of rose oil had already been secured in straw-lined frames. There were sacks of lentils, jars of pickled lemons for the crew, cedar pegs, spare sailcloth, a bundle of copper bowls, and 4 lengths of good cypress intended for repairs at some southern quay where timber was harder to come by. Faraj stood on the dock overseeing the loading, not with barked commands, but with little movements of chin and hand. When Sinbad greeted him, he returned the greeting, then finished watching the placement of the glass crate before turning his full attention. "Hadi has spoken of you," he said. "He says you can tell when paper is stored too near lamp oil and when a jar is shifted by the sound it makes against its neighbor." "I can tell sometimes," Sinbad said. "Sometimes is enough. Too much certainty makes poor company at sea." Faraj's eyes narrowed kindly, as if testing whether the younger man could carry understatement without dropping it. Satisfied, he continued. "The deviation to Duha's rest will cost time. Time is cargo. You know this. but Hadi's word carries weight with me. Also, I have long disliked hearing of small places erased by laziness. If you take responsibility for part of the expense and share in whatever labor the stop requires, I will consent. I will. No dramatics when we get there. None. No treating old stones as treasure merely because they are old. Only as stones that may still serve. Faraj nodded. Good. Then you may sail. So it was arranged. The days before departure passed in the steady music of preparation, which is one of the gentlest musics known to those who love the sea without idolizing it. Sinbad spent them between warehouse and quay, balancing accounts, checking stowage, packing his own modest sea chest, and acquiring what small necessities he preferred not to borrow once the river had widened into the Gulf. He chose a wool cloak for night watches, 2 spare tunics, writing reed and ink, a folded cloth for wrapping delicate fines or receipts, a knife sharpened but not ostentatious, and a little box of clove and mint for shipboard breath after salted meals. He bought also at the last moment 3 extra bundles of wick and a small tin of fine polish for glass and brass, though no one had asked him to. It simply felt right. On the evening before departure, he went again to the upper quarter and found Hadi seated in his narrow room above the sailmaker's lane. The room was simple and very clean. 2 rolled charts rested in a rack. A shelf held shells, weights, and small labeled jars of sand from different coasts. There was a brass lamp, an old astrolabe, a water bowl, and nothing superfluous except perhaps a carved cedar box, so worn by handling that it had become a smooth brown softness of edges. Through the lattice one could smell the city cooling and hear, far below, the last river traffic of the day. Hadi sat on a woven mat repairing the binding of a notebook with waxed thread. He did not look up immediately when Sinbad entered. You came, he said. I said only that I would think. And you thought your way aboard? I did. The old navigator tied off the thread. Good. On the mat beside him lay the 2 parchment slips Sinbad had seen before, now accompanied by a third. A rough list in Hadi's precise hand. It included oil, wick, cord, cedar pegs, small hammer, bronze pins, ink cleaning cloths, lime powder, ledger, sound line, and fresh water jars. You came prepared, Sinbad said. I came old, Hadi replied. Old men know what they forgot last time. He motioned Sinbad down to the mat, and together they reviewed the chart more closely. Hadi showed him the prevailing coastal current along the route they would take. The headland where water sometimes twisted unexpectedly near a submerged shelf. The outer markers by which Duha's rest had once been approached, and the reason the harbors had fallen out of favor with impatient captains. Its entrance required alignment. Not difficult if respected, but unforgiving of sloppiness. A sand tongue had grown over years where one side of the approach widened deceptively in full sun. The safeway remained nearer a dark seam of water and a low spit of stone on the western side. The lower lamps had once spoken that relation clearly. Without them, strangers favored the wrong gleam. And the creatures? Sinbad asked. not as a boy asking for marvels, but as a merchant trying to understand the habits of a place. Hadi's hand rested over the basin mark. They came at certain moons and seasons, not always in number, sometimes 3 or 4, sometimes a dozen. Great shellbacks, yes, but not only shellbacks. In the warmest years there were broad-headed sea cows too, and once, when I was young, a creature so large beneath the water that all we saw was the slow, dark ridge of its passage and the breathing spout when it rose beyond the basin. The harbor folk called them all the elders, and they believed the basin floor had warmth from deep beneath. And the creatures gathered there because the water eased them. I do not know if the belief was fully true, but the water was indeed warmer there. We measured it. Did they mind the ships? They minded noise more than ships. Heavy hammering after moonrise scattered them. Clean, quiet lantern light did not, nor oars moved gently. Hadi rolled the chart again, and for a while the two men sat with the small room darkening around them until Hadi lit the lamp. The light fell amber across his lined face and made the brass of the astrolabe gleam. Sinbad noticed how carefully the old man's hands moved still, though the skin on them had thinned. At last Hadi said, "Do not go to Duha's rest, expecting wonder. Go expecting work. If wonder comes, it will sit beside the work and make no noise." That sentence remained with Sinbad as strongly as the chart itself. They departed at dawn under a pale sky that had not yet chosen whether it would become gold or simply brighten. The river was wide and quiet, holding the city's reflection in long bands of soft color. Mud-brown walls, whitewashed facades, strips of blue cloth, date palm shadows, the early flames of cook fires from waterside kitchens. The quiet faith moved away from the quay, almost without spectacle. Men on deck loosened rope, shifted poles, checked sail ties. Faraj stood aft with one hand on the tiller until the river took them fully. Hadi sat near the mast on a low chest, wrapped in his cloak, the old chart case at his side. Sinbad, after helping settle the last stowage, he stood briefly at the rail and watched Basra widen behind them. He felt no dramatic wrench. He was too accustomed to departures for that. Instead, there came the familiar deepening of attention that always arrived when land began to slide and water began to decide the day's rhythm. Every sound mattered a little more. The rope against the cleat, the creak of mast wedges, the hiss of water along the hull, the flap, then gathering of sail, the river smell gradually yielding to something broader and saltier. A voyage, even a modest one, redraws the senses by increments. The crew of the Quiet Faith were 7, besides the captain and the 2 passengers. Rashid, the cook, was round-faced and silent until meals, after which he softened visibly. Karim, the rope master, had a scar across one eyebrow and the careful hands of a basket weaver. Musa, the youngest aboard, could climb the rigging like a cat crossing branches and still blush when praised. There was also Tariq, thin and long-wristed, who kept the lead line and watched for floating timber. Jalal, who knew how to mend sailcloth by touch and half light. Old Sami the helmsman, older than Faraj, but younger than Hadi, whose knees ached and whose instinct for current remained almost musical, and Dawood, who oversaw cargo hatches and could distinguish 10 woods by smell alone. They were not talkative men in the morning. That suited Sinbad. He spent the first day entering gently into shipboard time, lending where useful and otherwise learning again the little arrangements of the vessel. The paper bundles had to remain shaded. The glass lamps could not be jostled when the river chop crossed with outgoing current. The saffron chests needed air, yet not damp. The rose oil had to be checked after noon heat. Rashid's cooking brazier required a draft cover when the breeze turned. The extra wick bundles Sinbad had bought found place in a dry chest near Hadi's rolled chart case, and he felt obscurely pleased by that. By the second day, the river had widened into the gulf, and the land withdrawn into long, low lines. The sea there was not empty, though to an inland eye it might have seemed so. It held distance the way a great hall holds silence, with subtle textures of its own. Near morning, the water often looked pewter blue, with faint rippling over unseen changes of depth. By noon, it broke into plates of light. Toward evening, it softened again, taking rose, ash, and pearl from the sky. Flying fish startled from the bow, sometimes flickered briefly above the surface like shards of polished tin. A line of distant cormorants moved once along the horizon, as if written by a steady hand. Jellyfish, pale as blown glass, drifted past on calmer afternoons. At night the ship disturbed soft green luminescence in the water, and Musa, when he thought no one watched, would grin like a child at the faint stardust it left in their wake. Hadi did not fill the voyage with stories. He was too disciplined for that. Most days he sat where he could see both sail and water, speaking only when a correction mattered or when Faraj invited opinion. Yet his silence was not blank. It was attentive. He seemed always to be measuring things invisible to younger eyes. The length of a swell, the color under a wave's shoulder, the curve of birds returning landward at dusk, the way the wind smelled when it had come over shoals rather than open channels. Sometimes Sinbad sat near him without speaking, and learned more from following the old man's gaze than he would have from many words. On the fourth evening, when the sky had cleared after a brief noon haze and the stars came early and exact, Hadi unwrapped his astrolabe. The brass caught the lantern light, all circles and delicate cut work, and for a while the deck seemed to hold two heavens, one above, soft and immeasurable, and one in the old man's hands, reduced to instrument and use. Sinbad watched him take a height, note it, and then rest the astrolabe on his knee. "You have used one?" Hadi asked. "A little. A little becomes useful if it is repeated." Sinbad took the instrument when offered. The brass was cool and surprisingly heavy. Hadi showed him again the steadiness of grip, the patience of sighting, the refusal to hurry a star into alignment because one wishes to sleep. They worked in quiet beside the mast while the rest of the ship settled toward night routine. Rashid covered the brazier. Karim checked the forward lashings. Sami hummed under his breath at the stern. When the lesson was done, Sinbad passed the astrolabe back. You trust instruments, he said. I trust them to do what they were made to do, Hadi answered. No more, no less. Men err by asking a thing for what it does not promise. And charts? Likewise. And stories. At that, Hadi's mouth moved slightly. Not quite smile and not quite refusal. Stories promise less than men think, and more than they admit. The sea was dark velvet beyond the railing, breathing softly along the hull. Far above, the stars seemed innumerable and near. After a while, Hadi said, Duha's rest will not appear suddenly. Forgotten places rarely do. They gather toward you by signs. What signs? You will see. It was not until the 7th morning that the signs began. The wind had been kind, neither idle nor troublesome, and the quiet faith had made her way down the coast at a measured pace, stopping once at a small trading cove for water, and twice for the exchange of ordinary goods that kept Faraj's voyage practical. Then, after sunrise on the 7th day, the coastline altered. The broad, low shore gave way to a scattered country of pale islands and flat rocks, lifting from the sea like sleeping animals. Some were no more than shelves where gulls stood. Others held scrub, reeds, or a few wind-bent shrubs. And the water between them changed color continually, now bright green over sand, now slate blue over depth, now white sheened where a buried bar lifted close beneath the surface. Sami spat lightly over the side and peered ahead. Channels within channels, he murmured. Hadi nodded. Now we begin paying properly. They reduced sail somewhat and shifted weight with the care that narrow coastal work requires. The chart came out again. Hadi and Faraj studied it beside the mast while Sinbad held one corner against the breeze. The old ink islands corresponded imperfectly to the real ones, as such charts always do after years and storms. Yet the deeper relations remained. A low hooked sandbar to the east, a split rock like a broken tooth, a long shoal running north-south like a pale finger beneath the water. Beyond these, somewhere not yet seen, the entrance to Duha's rest. The first sign Hadi had meant was the water's warmth. By noon, the air remained much the same, but when Sinbad leaned over to rinse his hand after helping secure a line, he noticed the sea felt oddly temperate, not merely heated by the sun, but touched from within by some gentler source. He glanced toward Hadi, who had already observed it. The basin current begins out here, the old navigator said. The second sign was the birds. Not many, and not the diving kind. Instead, long-winged seabirds glided in slow, patient loops over a region of darker water southwest of the visible islands. They did not feed. They watched. Faraj marked them with a narrowing of the eyes. And the third? Sinbad asked quietly. Hadi raised a hand toward the west. At first, Sinbad saw nothing unusual. Then, in the distance beyond a low, chalky island, something smooth and dark rose above the waterline and remained there long enough to seem almost a stone. It was too rounded for rock and too deliberate in its movement. Another shape appeared farther beyond it. Then another, not leaping, not splashing, simply surfacing with enormous calm before sinking again. Their presence altered nothing on the sea, yet it altered the heart of the watching. "The elders," Hattie said. No one aboard spoke for several breaths. Even Musa on the rigging had gone still. One of the dark forms surfaced again, showing a domed back mottled with pale growth and the long sweep of water sliding from it. It might indeed have been a turtle, but of a size that asked the eye to become humble. Another showed only the gentle rise of its breathing and a smooth head that turned once toward the light before going under. Faraj let out the breath he had been holding. "Still here," he said. "Still here," Hadi agreed. The sight did not produce excitement of the kind young men might shout over. It produced quiet, a reverent practicality. The creatures were not performing. They were simply continuing lives vast enough not to require witness. And the ship, finding them there, felt suddenly small in a soothing rather than alarming way. They did not approach the creatures directly. Hadi would not allow it, and Faraj had no wish to. Instead, the quiet faith held to the charted line, working inward among the islands. The day lengthened. The sun lowered. Pale cliffs on one island took honey color. The water in the deeper channels darkened toward bottle green. The smell of the sea changed too, carrying not only salt, but the faint, earthy mineral scent that sometimes rises where warm water wells from below. By late afternoon, they saw, at last, the low island of Duha's Rest. It did not announce itself grandly. That would have been unlike it. It lay tucked behind two protecting shoals and a crescent arm of broken stone. More shelter than island, really. A narrow curve of land with a modest rise at one end and a scatter of structures so weathered they seemed at first no more than part of the rock. Only when the vessel drew closer did the details emerge. A quay of fitted stone, partly sunken on the inner side. A square cistern housed with half its roof gone. Two low lamp towers near the approach, and then farther up on the point, the remains of a higher lantern platform with one side collapsed. Behind these stood several old store sheds and perhaps 6 or 7 small dwellings of shell lime and rough-cut block, their roofs patched or fallen according to fortune. No smoke rose. No boats rocked at the inner moorings. No figures moved on the quay. Yet the place did not feel dead. It felt paused. Faraj brought the quiet faith in with exquisite slowness under Hadi's guidance, and Sami's hand on the tiller. Tariq sounded ahead. Musa watched the color of water over the side. Sinbad stood ready at the line. The entrance narrowed exactly as Hadi had promised, the deceptive bright shallows lying welcomingly to one side while the safer lane held darker, cooler water close to a line of submerged stone. Without the old lamps, a stranger might easily have guessed wrong. With patience, the ship glided through. Inside, the basin opened in hush. It was larger than the outer impression suggested, a rounded chamber of water held by island, shoal, and depth. The sea there moved differently, not still, but slowed and gathered, as though every swell arriving from outside had chosen courtesy upon entering. The warmth in the water deepened. Near the far edge of the basin, a broad, dark shape rose and sank again, so quietly that only the widening rings on the surface proved it had been there at all. The harbor was built because of this place, Hadi murmured, not the other way around. They made fast to the least damaged portion of the quay. The stones, though worn, held. Dawood tested them with his heel. Karim looped the mooring line twice for caution. Faraj looked long at the harbor buildings before speaking. "We stay 2 nights at least," he said. "Possibly more." No one objected. The first steps ashore were taken with the curious gentleness people use when entering a room long closed, but not abandoned. Sinbad jumped down to the quay and felt under his sandals the warmth still held by the stone. Salt had crystallized white in its cracks. Small sea plants grew where old mortar had worn away. A bronze ring for mooring remained fixed in one block, greened by weather but sound. Nearby lay the broken frame of what had once been a cargo handcart, its axle half buried in drift. The cistern house door hung crooked. One of the low lamp towers had lost its upper hood altogether. The higher platform on the point leaned like a shoulder long burdened. Yet in the shallows beside the quay, a fish moved calmly through clear green water, and behind the buildings a line of tamarisk shrubs stirred in the evening wind. A place so neglected should have felt melancholy. Instead it felt waiting. They explored before full dark. The cistern, once opened carefully, held water still, low but not foul. Its stone lining remained sound, though the cover beams had warped and one corner had cracked, allowing leaves and dust to gather. One store shed contained old rope, so rotten it dissolved in the hand, but beneath it were serviceable clay basins and 3 sealed jars of lime powder gone hard with damp. Another shed held only sand, shells, and silence. The dwellings had mostly been emptied long before. Yet in one, they found a broom of palm fiber, a broken reed mat, and a little niche in the wall, blackened above by many years of lamp smoke. Near the lower lamp tower, Sinbad discovered what looked at first like scattered stones. Kneeling, he brushed them clear and found the square socket of an old lantern post, iron still set within it. The metal flaked at touch, but it was there. Hadi, coming up behind him, gave a small sound of recognition. "That was the inlet guide," he said, "the first of the 3 low shore lights. Can it hold another post?" The old man crouched with effort, pressed the stone, studied the iron shoe. "Perhaps, if we do not ask it to be young again." That phrase pleased Sinbad, for it seemed to describe not only the harbor, but many things worth saving. They did not range far inland that evening. The light was lowering, and the basin already beginning to gather its night. Instead, they returned to the quay, ate a simple meal of lentils, dates, hard cheese, and bread softened with oil, and sat facing the water while dusk folded over the harbor. No one lit large deck lanterns. Faraj preferred dimness here, and Hadi had asked quietly for respect. So only one small shielded lamp burned on the quay beside them, enough to see bowl from hand and the edge of stone from dark water. The basin answered by revealing its older inhabitants. At first there were only circles widening on the surface in the outer half of the harbor. Then a dark head emerged, broad and ancient, with 2 eyes reflecting the small light only briefly before sinking again. Not far beyond it, a domed shell rose, larger than any fishing boat Sinbad had known as a boy, mottled with silver weed and pale barnacle scars. The creature drifted, breathed, and turned, the water folding away from it in soft lines. Another surfaced beside it, slightly smaller. Then, farther out, something not shelled at all rolled just beneath the surface. A vast, smooth-backed body, perhaps one of the sea cows Hadi had mentioned, moving with such ease that the water scarcely seemed to part around it. No one spoke for a long while. The creatures made no display. That was the deepest part of their power. They behaved as if no stories had ever been told about them, as if no generations of sailors had found them strange. They breathed. They floated. Once one let out a low exhalation like a jar emptied gently. Moonlight, rising pale over the island shoulder, spread itself along the basin and touched their backs. They became then not exactly silver, but something between stone and silk, older than both. Hadi sat with his hands on his knees, eyes fixed on the water. There, he whispered at last. There. Sinbad looked from the creatures to the broken lamp tower, the cracked cistern house, the collapsed upper platform. The relation between them settled into him slowly. Men had not built here because the harbor was convenient alone. They had built here because it was already a place of rest. The creatures had found it first, drawn by warmth and depth and shelter. Then sailors, attentive in older days, had noticed and shaped their use around that older belonging. A harbor built in humility lasts differently from one built in pride. Even broken, it keeps a certain tone. That night they slept lightly aboard the Quiet Faith, though not from unease. The basin itself seemed to encourage listening. Small waves touched the quay. Rope shifted. Once or twice during the night, Sinbad woke and heard the long, quiet exhale of one of the great creatures somewhere beyond the hull. The sound soothed him more than any city sound could have done. It was as if the basin were breathing through several ancient throats and asking nothing from the dark except to continue. Morning came in pearl and gold. The harbor looked changed, not because anything had yet been repaired, but because daylight clarified what could be done. Under full sun, the damage sorted itself into practical categories. The lower lamp socket was mostly sound. The key edge near the outer corner needed resetting, but had not entirely failed. The cistern cover required 2 new beams and a corner patch. One of the storage sheds could be made useful with sweeping and a new latch. The higher lantern platform was a larger problem, yet even there, the base stones held more firmly than the leaning upper frame had suggested. Faraj walked the place with Hadi and Sinbad, while the crew made notes aloud. First water, Faraj said. First light, Hadi countered. Both, Sinbad said, and the 2 older men looked at him. He went on quietly. A harbor without water cannot host labor. A harbor without light cannot explain itself to passing ships. We repair enough of the cistern this morning for safe use. By afternoon, we clear the lower lamp station and see what remains. Hadi's eyes warmed a little. Faraj merely grunted approval. which in him was stronger than praise. So the work began. It was not heroic work. That was part of its piece. They swept, lifted, sorted, scrubbed, measured, cleared, and carried. Karim and Dawood went at the cistern beams with saw and adze, and shaping replacements from the cypress lengths meant for another key farther down the route. Faraj accepted the sacrifice of cargo utility without complaint. A good captain knows when goods must become tools. Tariq and Musa cleaned the cistern mouth and lowered buckets to test depth and taste. The water was mineral sweet and slightly warm, just as Hadi remembered. Jalal patched cracks in 2 of the old basin jars, so water could be carried uphill later if needed. Rashid, freed from cooking for a few hours, swept one store shed until it stopped smelling entirely of old rot and began smelling merely of dry wood and salt. Sinbad and Hadi worked at the lower lamp tower. The old lantern housing had long vanished, but the stone plinth, post socket, and part of the hood frame remained. Among the debris lay 2 pieces of greened bronze, the 3 horn panel brackets, and the rusted remains of a turning ring. Hadi knelt longer than Faraj liked, tracing the fitting marks with one finger. "It was smaller than I remembered," he said. "Or you were larger," Sinbad answered. A brief smile passed under the old man's beard. That also. By midday they had raised from the debris enough hardware to imagine repair. Not restoration to old elegance, perhaps, but a useful lamp. Sinbad remembered then the crate of glass lamps aboard, and the extra wick bundles he had bought. Faraj, when asked, agreed to sacrifice one of the smaller cargo lanterns to the harbor's first light. "If the harbor wakes again," he said, "it may repay me in other ways than counting house profit." Heat gathered over the stone in the afternoon, but the basin wind kept it gentle. Sweat came and dried. Tools knocked softly. The cistern cover took shape. A patched store shed began to look capable of holding the rope and oil. Hadi moved between tasks with measured slowness, sitting when he must, rising when needed, and speaking mostly in observations so precise they saved labor. He noticed where salt had split the stone seams, where the old lamp hood had once directed rain, where the key line would need a marker if ever a second light were to stand above it again. More than once, Sinbad saw a younger crewman pause, not out of deference, but because the old man's eye was still surer than their own. By late day, the first part of the cistern was made safe. Clean cloth was stretched over the repaired section until the final patch could set. 2 jars were filled and carried to the shaded shed. Then all attention turned to the lamp. The chosen cargo lantern was plain but sound, its brass simple, its glass clear. It had been made to hang aboard ship, not to guide harbor traffic, yet usefulness often begins in adaptation. Karim fashioned a fitted collar from bronze scrap and cedar wedges. Dawood trimmed a short post to sit securely in the old socket. Jalal cut a shield of thin copper to act as a weather baffle on the windward side. Hadi, seated on an overturned block near enough to see but far enough not to hinder, directed their hands like a quiet conductor. Higher by a finger? No. Let the drain remain open. Set the glass so the clearer face takes the seaward angle. At last, when the sun leaned west and the basin had taken on again that reflective softness before evening, the small, adapted lamp stood ready upon the old lower plinth. It was not grand. It was enough. They did not light it immediately. Hadi would wait for the proper dimness, and Faraj insisted that if a passing ship saw any lamp at all, it should see one honestly placed. So while the day thinned, they climbed part way toward the middle rise above the harbor to look down on their work. From there, the basin spread beneath them in green and blue, with the quiet Faith moored like a patient bird at the quay. Beyond the basin edge, in deeper water, two dark shapes moved, one domed, one smooth-backed, keeping to their old route regardless of men. The second light stood there, Hadi said, pointing to a higher shelf of stone half-veiled in scrub, and the turning lantern beyond, on the point. If the place lives again, it should have at least those. But we do not demand tomorrow all at once. Sinbad shaded his eyes, and the middle shelf was reachable, though overgrown. The upper point would take more labor, yet neither seemed impossible. Who kept the harbor before? He asked. A small keeper's household, 2 hired hands in season, and sometimes one old pilot from the mainland, later fewer. Then perhaps no one permanently, only passing use. That is often how fading begins, not with one abandonment, but with smaller and smaller acts of arrival. They descended in silence. Evening had nearly settled. On the quay, Rashid laid out a meal more fragrant than the labor warranted. Rice with lentils and a little cinnamon, warm flatbread, olives, and a stew of onions, dried fish, and herbs found near the cistern wall. The smell of it mingled with salt air and cedar shavings. They ate sitting on the warm stones, all facing the basin, as if, without deciding it, Musa, too tired to be restless, nearly slept over his bowl. Faraj led him. Hadi ate little, but seemed strengthened by the sight of the repaired cistern cover and the lamp ready beside them. At last the light in the west thinned to that delicate interval when day seems to rest on its own threshold before slipping away. Hadi rose with one hand on his staff. Sinbad took up the small flame from the ship's shielded lantern and carried it to him. The crew fell quiet. Even the basin seemed to still. Hadi touched the flame to the wick. The lamp took it slowly, then with steadiness. Clear light gathered behind the glass and shone outward over the inner approach, modest at first, then warmer as the oil found its calm. The brass collar glowed. The cedar post caught gold at its edge. On the water before it, a small road of amber formed and trembled. No one applauded. No one needed to. Faraj removed his cap and held it briefly against his chest. Rashid made a low, thankful sound in his throat. Karim, who trusted rope and wood more than ceremony, simply nodded once and sat down again. Hadi remained standing a little longer, his face lit from below by the first harbor lamp, to burn there in many years. There, he said, almost too softly to hear. Now the place remembers itself, Out in the basin, as if in answer but not performance, one of the great shellbacks surfaced and drifted through the lamp's outer reflection. Light moved over its weathered dome like honey over old bronze. Another rose behind it, larger still, and breathed. The sound crossed the harbor like a sleeper's long, contented sigh. Night gathered around the small new lamp. The basin held the creatures. The repaired cistern cooled. The quiet harbor, no longer wholly dark, rested between what it had been and what it might yet become. And there, with the first honest light burning again on the stone where generations had once trusted it, Sinbad sat beside the old navigator and understood that some of the oldest things in the world were not merely creatures or waters or islands, but the gentle work of returning care to a place that had waited without bitterness for someone to remember. They sat with it until the lamp had settled into its full and patient burning, and the basin had accepted the new light as though it had been expecting that small return all along. The flame did not waver much. The glass, though meant once for a vessel and not for a shore tower, held its warmth evenly, and the brass collar Karim had shaped from scrap metal shone like a modest ring at the throat of the old post. Across the water, the amber reflection stretched and broke and gathered again, broken by the slow surfacing of broad, dark backs that seemed to rise from some deeper sleep than men ever know. The creatures moved in their own old order. One of the great shelled ones drifted so near the lamp path that Sinbad could see, even in the hush of evening, the rigid years written over its back. Small pale growths clung to the shell like weathered ivory. Water streamed down the curved dome in quiet silver threads. It lifted its head once, not in alarm, not in curiosity exactly, but in the unhurried manner of something that had lived long enough to have no need of haste. Then it breathed, folded back into the basin's dark warmth, and disappeared beneath a widening circle of light. No one aboard the Quiet Faith or on the quay chose to disturb that motion with many words. Rashid cleared the bowls softly. Musa, though young and often given to sudden speech when delighted, only leaned his chin upon his knees and watched. Faraj rested one forearm on the rail and followed the creatures with eyes narrowed, not from suspicion, but from care. Hadi remained where he was, hands on his staff, the new lamp painting, one side of his face in amber and leaving the other in moon-cooled shade. Sinbad sat close enough to hear the old man's breathing and, beyond it, the breathing of the basin itself. Water folding against stone, rope touching wood, the long, low exhale of ancient lungs somewhere beyond the little harbor's edge. At length Hadi said very softly, "The place remembers. That is good. But remembering is only the beginning. Tomorrow it must also be tended." Sinbad turned the words over in his mind as one turns a shell smooth at the lip from years of tide. They sounded simple, but they held the shape of the work ahead. A place once neglected does not wake fully because one lamp is lit and one cistern covered. It wakes by repetition, by returning at dawn, by cleaning soot from glass, by carrying oil. by setting stones straight and writing down what must not be forgotten. That kind of waking suited him far more than any loud triumph would have done. The moon climbed higher. The basin took on a deeper silver. More of the creatures rose and sank at intervals, never crowding, never hurrying one another, and never making the harbor feel strange. Instead, they made it feel older and therefore calmer. The ship's men drifted one by one toward sleep. Faraj ordered no broad deck lanterns lit that night, and no one objected. The single shore lamp was enough. Its small certainty gentled the dark more effectively than brightness would have done. Before Sinbad lay down, he walked once along the quay with a fresh jar of oil in hand. He checked the lamp as if he had already been doing so for years. The wick burned cleanly, while the copper weather baffle held. The cedar wedges remained tight in the old stone socket. He added a little oil, wiped the rim with cloth, and stood for a moment looking not at the harbor, but past it, toward the deeper basin where the oldest waters gathered. Far out under the moon, one vast smooth-backed body rolled just enough to catch the light, then vanished again as if sinking not into water, but into time itself. He slept aboard the quiet Faith, though lightly and with the unusual sweetness that follows honest labor in salt air. Once in the night, he woke to the sound of a Hadi moving along the quay with his staff. The old man was only checking the lamp and the mooring lines, and because the sound was so measured and familiar at once, Sinbad drifted back to sleep before his head had fully lifted from the folded cloak beneath it. Morning came pale and cool, with a faint milk-blue haze lying low over the outer islands. The harbor had the soft look of a bowl just rinsed. Dew had gathered along the railings and on the ropes where they crossed the cleats. The lamp still burned, though lower now and gentler, its work done until evening. Rashid was already crouched by the brazier, coaxing flame from charcoal. The smell of warmed bread and a little onion rose into the morning air. Somewhere close beneath the quay, fish flickered in the green water. The first task was to extinguish and clean the lamp properly. Hadi insisted upon this himself. A harbor light is not a festival torch, he said as Sinbad brought cloth and oil. If it is to guide honestly, it must sleep honestly too. So they did the work without rushing. The wick was pinched out, not blown. The glass was allowed to cool before it was lifted. The soot line was slight, which pleased Hadi. Sinbad wiped the inner pane until it shone again. Karim checked the cedar wedges. Dawood tapped the base stone with the wooden end of a hammer and pronounced it sound, enough for several more nights of use. The little adapted lamp, though humble, had taken its first watch well. After bread and dates, they climbed to the middle shelf above the harbor, where the second low shore light had once stood. Daylight made the ascent easier than it had looked from below, though the path had half gone to brush and rubble. Wild thyme grew between the stones. Salt-resistant grasses lay silver where the wind had bent them. Here and there, old paving showed through the soil, worn smooth in the center by many generations of sandaled feet. That touched Sinbad deeply for reasons he would not yet have named. there is something in an old path that consoles. Even after neglect, it continues to remember the shape of use. The middle station stood upon a shelf of rock a little inward from the harbor mouth, where anyone tending it would have seen both the outer channel and the inner curve of the quay. Its tower had not fully fallen, but the lamp housing was gone, and the little retaining wall behind it had slumped so that brush had rooted among the stones. Hadi stopped before it and rested both hands upon the top of his staff. "This light corrected the eye," he said. "The lower invited, this one advised." "Then we should earn its advice," Faraj said. That became the day's work. They cleared brush first. Musa, quick and light-footed, cut back the thickest growth with a short knife. Tariq gathered the cut stems into bundles and carried them away from the station, so no dry litter would catch stray spark near the evening lampwork below. Sinbad and Karim reset the retaining wall as best they could, lifting each stone and bedding it again with sand and shell fragments. Hadi sat upon a flat rock where he could see the angle of the old station and corrected them now and then with a lifted finger or a quiet word. "Not there. That stone was always meant to drain behind. Leave the smaller one under the lip. It gives the larger purchase. Do not make it too beautiful. A harbor station should look sound, not vain." By midday they had uncovered the post socket. This one had fared worse than the lower. Salt had eaten part of the iron sleeve. One side of the stone rim had cracked. Yet it remained possible to mend. Dawood proposed turning one of the spare copper bowls into a weather hood if a lantern body could be found to fit beneath it. Rashid, unexpectedly useful in matters beyond food, suggested the old brass tea-urn lid might serve as an inner reflector if flattened slightly. Faraj approved with a grunt that meant more effort could be spent. The quiet faith was becoming, in gentle measure, less a trading vessel for the moment than a floating storehouse of futures. Before they descended for the noon meal, Hadi walked farther along the shelf to where the path bent toward the point of the upper lantern. The old turning light stood, or rather leaned, in much the same attitude it had shown from below. Not dead, not sound, but tired. The platform beneath it had once been circular, or nearly so, yet with a low parapet wall and a narrow ring where the lantern might have turned. One section had broken away entirely, revealing the dressed stone fill beneath. Yet the central pillar, though weather-worn, remained upright. A gull had nested in a corner where the old housing must once have stood. White salt streaks marked the stone where rain and the sea wind had done their slow, patient work. Sinbad joined Hadi there and looked out. From the point, the harbor revealed its true design more clearly than from below. The protecting arm of rock curved inward with intelligent modesty. The shoals beyond lay like pale, sleeping forms under the water. The deeper basin, where the creatures rose at night, showed itself in a different shade. A green so dark it almost appeared blue. Farther out, beyond the outer bars and little islands, the sea widened again into brightness. Any sailor approaching from the south or east would have felt relief at the sight of a high turning light there, steady and deliberate above those deceptive shallows. Hada's gaze remained on the horizon for a long time. When I was younger, he said, I thought a place like this existed only to be useful to travelers. I measured it in water, in shelter, in repair, in safe anchorage. I was not wrong, but I was incomplete. Sinbad waited. The old man's hand moved slightly on the staff. The creatures taught the harbor keepers more than the keepers taught the creatures. That was the part I did not understand. Men who work too long among ledgers and roots sometimes begin to think that usefulness begins when men arrive. Often it begins much earlier. Do you think that is why the place faded? Sinbad asked. Because later men forgot to notice what came first? In part. Also because trade shifts. Also because larger harbors pull greedily. Also because small duties exhaust people when they are not shared. Fading rarely comes from one cause alone. But yes, to forget the older rhythm of a place is always dangerous. A harbor built against its own basin will not keep its grace. The wind moved over them then, carrying a faint mineral warmth from the deeper water below. Sinbad breathed it in and thought how strange and how consoling it was that the sea could smell different within the span of one small inlet. Outside, the air held the usual brightness of salt and distance. Here, on the point above the basin, it carried also the soft undernote of warmed stone and something earth deep, as though the water had passed through caverns long before touching open light. Below, Rashid called them down to eat. They took their meal in the shade of the patched store shed. The harbor had begun already to feel less like an abandoned stopping place and more like a camp of orderly purpose. Water jars stood where they could be reached easily. Tools lay sorted rather than scattered. The repaired section of the cistern cover no longer looked temporary in the morning sun. The little shore lamp, cleaned and ready for evening, shone faintly at its post, even unlit. Rashid served lentils with cumin and a little garlic, flatbread, olives, and slices of salted lemon whose brightness suited the noon warmth. Smoosa slept for a little while afterward on a coil of rope, and would have continued sleeping had not Karim nudged his foot with paternal gentleness. During that quiet interval, Sinbad found, in a half-collapsed side chamber off the store shed, a set of shallow wall niches blackened by old lamp smoke. In one niche lay a thin object wrapped in rotted cloth. He brought it outside and unfolded it carefully. Within was a small board of cedar covered in wax, long hardened and cracked, with the traces of incised writing beneath. Hadi, when he saw it, sat up straighter than he had all day. A harbor tablet, he said. The wax was too split to read easily in full sun, but after warming it slightly and brushing it with the softest cloth they had, enough of the old entries appeared to make sense. Dates, tides, account of oil jars, a note about incoming pottery from the North Islands, repairs to the cistern, wind from the west after moonrise. The hand varied in neatness across the years, but the habit remained the same. Write down what the place needs. One line, scratched deeper than the rest and still very clear, simply read, "No nets in inner basin after lamplighting. Elders rising. Another, perhaps later, said, "Hammer, only before dusk, when the warm current begins." Hadi touched the tablet's edge with 2 fingers. "There, you see? The harbor was governed around them, not beside them." Faraj leaned over to read. "Then we do the same." No one argued. That afternoon, their labor took on a slightly different quality. Before, they had been merely restoring usefulness. Now they understood more fully the shape that usefulness must keep. It was not enough to rebuild lamps and clear stones. The harbor must wake in the old courteous manner, with room left for the creatures whose basin it had always been. That knowledge gentled their hands further. Heavy hammering was finished before the shadow line reached the quay. Wood was cut and fitted while the sun still stood high. Plans for later work were spoken in lower voices as dusk approached. By the time evening gathered, the middle station had its wall reset and its post socket braced, though no lantern yet stood there. The upper point had been cleared of loose rubble, and the gull's nest gently relocated to a safer shelf nearby. The old harbor tablet rested wrapped in clean cloth in the driest corner of the store shed. Sinbad had begun a fresh ledger beside it, using one of the paper bundles from the Quiet Faith and a reed pen trimmed carefully by the light of the late afternoon. He wrote the date, the nature of the repairs, the condition of the cistern, the labor done, and the note copied faithfully from the old tablet. No nets in inner basin after lamplighting. Elders rising. It gave him comfort to set new ink beside old observance. That evening, when the lower lamp was lit again, the basin seemed to accept it more readily. Or perhaps it was only that the men who watched had become more attuned to the harbor's quiet responses. The creatures came earlier. One great shell-backed elder rose almost directly beyond the line of the quay, drifted for several breaths in the last blue light, and then sank without sound. Another, smooth and broad, surfaced farther out and turned so slowly that the moon, not yet fully risen, drew a pale curve along its wet back. No splash, no disturbance, only the soft, enduring fact of life proceeding at a rhythm far slower than trade winds or market prices. On the second night in Duha's rest, Sinbad did not sleep at once. Instead, he asked Faraj whether he might take the little skiff and sit within the basin for a time, after moonrise, rowing gently and making no noise. Faraj, after glancing toward Hadi, agreed. "Stay within the inner warmth," the captain said. "Do not approach them more than they permit." Hadi added only, "Listen more than you look." So after the meal had been cleared and the lamp checked, Sinbad lowered the small skiff into the water. Musa begged to come, but Faraj sent him to sleep with a kindness that left no room for complaint. Sinbad rowed alone. The oars dipped shallow and slow. The skiff moved away from the quay with hardly a ripple. Behind him, the little harbor lamp made a low amber star against the stone. Ahead, the basin widened under moonlight. The water was warmer there, undeniably. He trailed one hand beside the skiff and felt the change as one feels moving from shadow into sun. Not hot, not strange, only gently tempered, as if some deep current had folded warmth upward from the earth's own long keeping. The skiff drifted when he rested the oars. No insects troubled the surface. No harsh wind crossed the basin. Around him the dark water breathed. Then one of the creatures rose so near that he heard the first exhale before he fully saw it. A broad, ancient head surfaced, followed by the rounded shell. Its pattern picked out in moon, silver, and dark, mossy green. The creature's eye, when it turned slightly toward him, reflected nothing aggressive or startled. It seemed as old wells seem old, full of a depth one does not try to measure aloud. It floated there beside the skiff, not touching, not retreating. Both of them held in the basin's warmth. Sinbad could hear the dripping from its shell, and beneath the skiff, the almost inaudible shifting of water around a body immense and unhurried. Then it sank again, not downward exactly, but away, like a thought returning to its own deeper place. A little farther on, he saw two others drifting together, shells nearly touching. Farther still, a great smooth-backed form rolled, breathed in a sighing whisper, and vanished. The basin contained them without strain. On the harbor's stone edge, the lamp, the old key, and the skiff with one silent merchant upon it. All these felt temporary compared to the creature's relation to that warm water. He remained there a long time, the oars across his knees, listening. When at last he returned to the key, Hadi was still awake, seated near the lamp. "Well?" the old man asked. Sinbad drew the skiff partly ashore and stood a moment with both hands on its rim. "They make the harbor smaller," he said, "and more important at the same time." Hadi's eyes rested on him with quiet approval. Yes. The next morning, a sail appeared in the outer brightness. At first it was only a pale angle moving between the low islands. Then the hull came clear. A narrow coaster, lightly laden, making its way with caution among the shallows. Faraj studied it through narrowed eyes, and Hadi watched the line it took. The vessel did not stand directly toward the harbor, yet it did not ignore it either. At length it hove to beyond the outer shoals, and a small boat put off. "Someone remembers," Hadi said. The boat that came ashore carried two people, a middle-aged fisherman with shoulders gone smooth by decades of rowing, and an elderly woman seated in the stern beneath a dark blue shawl. Her face was brown and fine-boned, her eyes clear and unsentimental. She stepped from the boat with more steadiness than many younger people. When she saw Hadi standing by the quay, she stopped and gave a small sound from deep in her throat that was not surprise alone. "So you have come back after all," she said. Hadi's weathered face altered into something very near gladness. "Nafisa." The woman looked beyond him at the lit lamp post, though morning had extinguished the flame. She took in the repaired cistern cover, the tidied shed, the people moving with purpose. Then she nodded once, as if a long question had received its answer. Nafisa had been, it turned out, the daughter of one of the harbor's last regular keepers. In girlhood, she had carried water to the lamp stations and trimmed reeds for padding cargo jars. Later, she had married a fisherman on a neighboring island and gone away. She had heard from a netter who passed southward that a small lamp had been seen again at Dua's Rest. She had not trusted rumor until she saw the place with her own eyes. "I did not think I would see light here again," she said. Her companion, a nephew named Imran, brought from their boat a basket of dried mullet, a jar of capers in brine, and 2 lengths of woven reed matting for the floor of the keeper's room, if anyone sleeps ashore again, he said simply. Nafisa stayed that whole day, and by her presence, the harbor gained not only one more pair of hands, but memory of a different sort. Hadi remembered charts, soundings, alignments, and trade habits. Nafisa remembered household rhythms. She knew where a covered oil shelf had once stood behind the cistern house. She knew that the upper lantern mechanism had been turned by a weighted cord, not a hand crank. She knew which room in the old keeper's dwelling stayed coolest in summer and least damp in winter. She knew that a little stone trough by the tamarisk shrubs had once been filled for pack animals, and that the channel behind the west shed had carried off rainwater until children let it choke with reed roots. All these things mattered. Harbors, like homes, and survive by humble details. Under her direction, Sinbad and Karim uncovered the old oil shelf. Rashid cleared the drainage channel. Musa and Imran cut new reeds for padding and stuffed them beneath the repaired water jars. Nafisa herself, though slight, climbed halfway to the middle shelf and pointed out where a low handrail had once stood for carrying oil in windy weather. "If you relight the second lamp," she said, "someone will slip there if you do not give them a guide in the dark." Faraj listened carefully. Men who truly know vessels usually respect those who truly know shore stations. By evening of that day, they were ready to attempt the middle light. The lantern body for it came from a clever marriage of things not originally intended to become one object. Dawood had flattened Rashid's tea-urn lid into a shallow backplate polished as bright as he could manage. Karim shaped a collar from bronze scrap. Jalal framed clear glass panes around 2 sides and a slightly thicker pane toward the seaward face. Nafisa insisted on a better weather lip above the vent and showed them how her father had once woven a little copper mesh inside to keep nesting insects from the warm lamp crown. Musa climbed and passed tools with unusual solemnity, aware that he was helping build not cargo equipment, but a harbor sign. They set it at dusk. Sinbad, standing back on the path below with Hadi and Nafisa, saw at once how the harbor changed when the second light was kindled. The lower amber lamp still invited, as Hadi had said. The middle one, set upon its shelf and shining steadier from a slightly greater height, drew the eye inward and away from the false brightness of the outer shoals. It did not need color. Its position and depth of reflection were enough. The two together made a sentence across the dimming water. Nafisa wiped at one eye with the corner of her shawl, but did not weep. "My mother used to say the harbor looked polite when both were lit." "It does," Sinbad said. That night no ship arrived, and it did not matter. Some completions are for the place itself, not the first witness who happens by. The following days unfolded in the slow, useful richness that often comes when work, Memory and landscape begin at last to agree with one another. Nafisa remained. Imran went back and forth to his fishing island with small gifts and news, bringing more reed matting, goat milk, a sack of onions, and once a young cousin who knew how to patch stone with shell lime in the old island manor. The Quiet Faith's crew worked under Faraj's measured guidance until the upper point began to look less like a ruin and more like an unfinished promise. The circular parapet was rebuilt where it had fallen. The old turning ring, found in 3 pieces beneath wind-blown sand, was cleaned, pinned, and set on a new wooden race. The weighted cord system Nafisa remembered could not be restored exactly. So Dawood and Karim devised a simpler turning frame, balanced by a clay weight, hung within the pillar's lee. Hadi approved with care. Not as it was, he said, but perhaps as it wants to be now. Sinbad's ledger grew thicker with neat entries. Oil use at the lower lamp, repair of middle station, arrival of Nafisa bin Saleh, discovery of old oil shelf, clearing of west drainage, observation, warm current strong at moonrise, 3 elders surfaced within inner basin, no nets set, hammering ceased before dusk. He wrote not like a clerk preserving mere transaction, but like a man learning that record itself can be an act of care. Passing vessels began to notice the change. First there was a date boat hugging the coast, which stood off at sunset and signaled by lamp. Faraj signaled back, and the boat's master came in cautiously, filled water jars, traded 2 bundles of date fiber for dried fish from Imran's people, and went on his way at dawn. Then a small pottery coaster from the North Islands entered at midday, delighted to find the cistern functioning, and the key stable enough for brief unloading. Its captain left behind 4 broad-mouthed jars in exchange for a length of spare rope and news of a good anchorage farther south. Another vessel, carrying indigo and plain cloth, chose to spend 1 night in the basin, after hearing from the date boat that the old warm harbor was honest again. Word spread in the oldest way, by use and by quiet speech among mariners. What pleased Sinbad most was that the harbor did not swell into noise. It received, it sheltered, it exchanged, it remained itself. The creatures continued to rise after moonrise as before. Captains entering were told, gently and firmly, that no net was to be cast inside the inner basin after lamps were lit, that hammering ceased before dusk, that the key took modest craft best, and that those wanting only a quick, careless stop would do better elsewhere. Strangely, or perhaps not strangely at all, these rules increased respect rather than diminishing trade. Sailors trust limits when they sense those limits arise from long knowledge. One evening, after a narrow pottery vessel had departed and the basin lay calm again, Faraj sat with Sinbad on the quay beside the lower lamp. The captain held a small cup of mint water and watched the light move over the stone. "You have a merchant's head," he said, "but it is becoming less greedy." Sinbad smiled. "I hope it was never very greedy." "No, only eager, which can resemble greed on short acquaintance." Faraj drank. If this place becomes popular again, it must not be ruined by success. Sinbad looked toward the upper point, where the unfinished turning lantern stood against the evening sky. I have thought the same. Then think farther. A harbor can die from neglect. It can also die from too much use of the wrong kind. Those words stayed with him. They joined what Hadi had taught, and what the harbor tablet had preserved, and what the creatures themselves, simply by continuing, seemed always to be saying. Usefulness without reverence wears a place thin. Reverence without use leaves it brittle. The true life lies somewhere between, in patient balance. That night the moon rose nearly full, and the basin shone so softly that even the old shell-backed elders appeared not dark, but silver gray. Nafisa sat with Hadi near the middle path and spoke of years long past. Their voices came and went on the wind in low murmurs. Sinbad did not listen for words. It was enough to hear memory being shared in tones so calm that the harbor itself seemed to rest deeper around them. And the next morning, Hadi asked Sinbad to walk with him to the upper point before the others began work. The air was cool yet. Dew held in the time. The two lower lamps, extinguished, still smelled faintly of warm oil and clean soot. They climbed slowly, Hadi setting the pace with his staff. At the upper platform, the sea beyond the islands lay pale as beaten pewter under dawn light. No creatures showed yet in the basin, though now and then a widening ring marked where one had gone down late. Hadi stood near the central pillar and looked not at the horizon this time, but at the half-mended turning frame. "There is something I have not yet told you," he said. Sinbad waited, his hands loosely folded behind him. "In the years when Duha's rest was fading, then I was asked, by men richer and more impatient than wise, to recommend which smaller stations could be left untended without serious loss. I was younger then, and proud of being consulted. I knew already that great harbors drew more revenue. I knew also that this one required care, and that many shipmasters had grown lazy in their route keeping. I told myself that if Duha's rest dimmed, captains could simply use the larger northern inlet instead." The old man's voice remained steady, but it grew quieter. "I was not wholly responsible. Many hands and many omissions fed the decline. Still, I wrote that it was dispensable." He said the word almost as if it tasted unpleasant. Sinbad felt no shock, only a tender sadness on the old man's behalf. The harbor, the creatures, the recovered tablet, the years of dimness, all these made the confession feel less like scandal than like a stone, long carried and finally laid down. "Hence your return," Sinbad said. Hadi inclined his head. "In part, age does not cure every vanity at once. It only makes some of them too heavy to carry comfortably." For a while they stood in the wind without speaking. Then Sinbad said, "You did return." "Yes." "You remembered before it was too late." Hadi looked toward the basin where the warm water darkened. "We do not know how late is too late for places. Sometimes they endure our neglect better than we deserve. Sometimes they do not. In this case, the creatures remained. The basin remained. A few memories remained. That is mercy. They descended together And after that confession, Hadi seemed not lighter exactly, but more settled, and as though the harbor itself had received a burden from him. The upper turning lantern was completed 3 days later. Those days were full. Imran brought 2 polished horn panes from his island, taken long ago from a storm-broken shrine lantern, and kept wrapped in wool against some future need no one had named until now. Dawood fitted them into the housing's windward face. Karim adjusted the weight so the lantern turned with slow regularity when the sea breeze freshened after sunset. Nafisa found an old brass finial buried near the tamarisk shrubs and laughed softly when it proved to fit the crown almost exactly. My father would be irritated to see his careful burying undone, she said, and Hadi answered, then let him be mildly irritated in paradise. The harbor requires him. When the turning mechanism was first tested, it made a faint rubbing sound. Jalal packed the race with tallow and fine sand, and the sound softened to a whisper. The light could not truly revolve as the grand port lanterns did, but it could slowly shift and breathe across the outer approach, enough to reassure a cautious vessel that the point lived again. By then, Duha's rest had begun to draw a small life around itself. Not bustle, never that, but order. A fisher family from Imran's island used one of the repaired dwellings for 2 nights while salting mullet. A pottery captain left 6 narrow-necked water jars in exchange for safe mooring and a list of needs to carry onward. Another boat brought lamp oil packed in goat skins and took away dried fish, capers, and 2 rolls of woven reed matting. Sinbad bartered modestly, always with one eye on usefulness rather than profit alone. The harbor, he had learned, should not become an appetite. At last, on a twilight washed in rose and pearl, they lit all 3 lights. It was done with no audience except those who belonged there by work or memory. That made it better. The lower lamp took first, warm and amber upon the quay. The middle lamp shone next from its shelf, giving the approach its measured inward counsel. Then Hadi, with Sinbad beside him, and Nafisa just below the parapet wall, touched flame to the wick of the upper turning lantern. It gathered slowly, brighter within than without for one breath, and then the horn panes warmed. The polished brass caught the fire, and the high light leaned outward over sea and shoal and little island in one gentle sweep. The weighted cord began its patient work. The beam shifted, paused, returned, shifted again. From below, Faraj let out a long breath through his nose. Rashid, not a man much given to grand expression, murmured a blessing. Musa smiled so widely he could not hide it. In the basin, one of the smooth-backed elders surfaced as if to witness nothing more than the evening, yet its great dark form passing beneath the new highlight made everyone present feel the relation at once. Ancient water, returning flame, patient stone, and the small, honest industry of human hands. No shouting followed. They simply stood and watched until the sea had fully accepted the 3-fold line. That very night, a vessel entered by the restored lights. It came from the southwest, no larger than the Quiet Faith, carrying sacks of frankincense, dyed yarn, and 2 narrow crates of glazed bowls. Its captain, a woman named Zura with silver threaded through her hair, who had known Dua's rest in childhood from her father's charts, but had never expected to use it herself. When she stood upon the quay after entering and looked up at the 3 lights, she shook her head in calm amazement. "I was told there was only a broken harbor here and warm water where old things surfaced," she said. "There is still warm water," Nafisa replied, "and old things. But the harbor is trying again." Zura smiled at that and stayed 2 nights. She brought fine lamp oil in exchange for fresh water and safe rest. She listened carefully when told the basin rules and agreed at once. On the 2nd evening, she stood with Sinbad at the lower lamp and watched the elders rise. "I have seen richer anchorages," she said, "but few truer ones." The phrase pleased him because it seemed exactly right. Faraj eventually had to think again of his voyage beyond Duha's rest. Cargo must continue. Promises made elsewhere must be honored. The quiet faith could not become permanently moored in one harbor, however beloved. Yet he delayed his departure just enough to ensure that the place could sustain itself when the vessel sailed on. A pattern was settled. Nafisa would remain through the warm season, and perhaps longer. Imran and his fishing kin would come and go, bringing fish, reed goods, and news. One room of the keeper's dwelling was made habitable again with matting and patched shutters. The oil shelf held a modest but sufficient reserve. The cistern cover was finished properly and marked in Sinbad's ledger for inspection after each major rain. A bell, small but clear, was hung near the middle shelf to sound in fog or heavy dark. Then the old harbor tablet was set in a dry niche, and Sinbad copied its surviving rules and additions onto fresh paper, adding his own hand beneath. No nets in inner basin after lamp lighting, hammering only before dusk when the warm current begins. Visiting craft to keep basin quiet after moonrise, water and shelter for patient ships. No waste thrown into the warm basin. Lights to be trimmed at dawn and before sunset without fail. Hadi read the list and nodded. Good. It governs by remembering, not by boasting. As departure drew nearer, Sinbad found himself walking more often to the upper point alone in early morning or late afternoon. He would stand there and look not only at the harbor, but through it, as if the little place had become a lens through which other parts of his own life could be read more clearly. He thought of Basra's busier quays, of ledgers, of cargoes, of seasons spent pursuing routes because they were profitable and well-trodden, rather than because they deepened the world. Profit was not dishonorable. He knew that. Ships could not be provisioned with poetry. Yet the weeks at Duha's rest had altered the proportions of his mind. He no longer wanted merely to move goods safely from one market to another. He wanted, where possible, to keep open the smaller, truer links by which sailors, islands, coves, and forgotten basins remained human to one another. One evening, perhaps a week after the high lantern had first burned, he brought this thought to Hadi. They were seated beside the lower lamp with its glass open for trimming before dusk. The basin breathed in soft gold and green. Voyage was aboard the Quiet Faith, checking lashings in preparation for imminent departure. Nafisa had taken Imran's younger cousins to the middle shelf with a jar of oil and much instruction about steady hands. The harbor had fallen into one of those useful silences in which every person is occupied and no voice needs to rise. Sinbad said, "When we leave, I do not want to leave the place merely to memory again." Hadi snipped a charred edge from the wick and laid it aside. "Then do not. I have means enough to spare a little oil, some replacements, perhaps even arrange that certain coasters carry goods through here each season. But I do not want to burden it with traffic. No. I was thinking instead of making it a harbor of measured passage, a place named in certain ledgers not for heavy trade but for honest shelter, water, minor repair, and quiet exchange, a harbor with limits written into the use." Hadi replaced the cleaned glass and looked up. "Then you have understood it." The old man's tone held no grand approval, only the steadiness of a chart aligning at last with coastline. That meant more. When the Quiet Faith at last made ready to sail on, the harbor no longer felt paused. It felt inhabited by rhythm. Lamps were trimmed before sundown without needing reminders. Water jars stood clean. The quay edge held. 2 visiting vessels had come and gone under the 3 lights. The creatures still rose after moonlight, untroubled and immense. Nafisa knew every station by touch. Imran's kin had begun repairing the little animal trough and the west drainage channel, simply because such work now seemed worth doing. And the upper lantern turned with patient grace whenever the sea breeze freshened. Faraj oversaw loading with his usual calm economy. Some trade had indeed been made. The Quiet Faith took on dried fish, capers, a little shell lime, 2 bundles of reed matting, and promise of future exchange written in Sinbad's hand for captains willing to stop with lamp oil, plain cloth, paper, ceramic jars, and cedar pegs. More than goods, however, the vessel carried out word. That was inevitable and not unwelcome. Duha's rest was no longer silent, but the word it would carry would be shaped carefully. On the morning of departure, the basin lay almost mirror still. The elders had sunk early after moonrise, leaving only the faint memory of their circles on the water. The lamps, cleaned and sleeping, held the smell of warm brass and wick. Rashid prepared a breakfast finer than usual in honor of leaving. Barley cakes brushed with oil, soft cheese, dates, olives, and tea scented with mint, and a little crushed fennel seed Nafisa had found growing behind the cistern house. They ate on the quay because no one wished to hide inside the ship's shadow for that meal. When it was done, Hadi handed Sinbad a small wrapped bundle. Inside lay the old harbor chart, newly backed with fresh cloth and stitched at the edges where time had thinned it. "I have made a newer copy," the old navigator said. "This one should travel with someone who has now seen the place breathe again." Sinbad looked up, surprised. "It belongs to you. It belongs to the harbor and to whoever can read it faithfully. At my age, possession is merely delayed passing." Sinbad accepted it with both hands. Nafisa, seeing this, brought forward something smaller, a brass oil measure marked with tiny notches on its side. "My mother used it at the middle lamp," she said. "Take it if you mean truly to send oil and keep count. A promise measures better when the cup is honest." Faraj, who disliked sentimentality but never disdained utility, gave Sinbad a plain cedar box with fitted lid. "For the chart, the measure, and those papers of yours, salt eats memory faster than men think." So equipped, and with his heart fuller than when he had entered the harbor, Sinbad stood once more upon the quay as the quiet faith prepared to ease away. Yet when the mooring lines were loosened and the sail gathered its first breath, he did not at once step aboard. Faraj noticed and waited, saying nothing. Hadi noticed and smiled only with his eyes. The basin, the quay, the lamps, Nafisa on the middle path, Imran by the trough, the old warm water beyond with its hidden elders. All these held together in one quiet claim. "I will not sail farther south this season," Sinbad said at last. "My part of the cargo can go with you. My accounts will survive the delay. I will remain here through one full turning of moon and tide at least." Faraj rested both hands on the tiller head. "I thought you might." "Will that trouble the voyage?" "No. It will change the ledger a little and improve it in ways not counted." The captain said it so calmly that the choice felt less like a rupture than like a tide taking the channel it had always intended. Rashid nodded as if this, too, were a sensible adjustment to stores. Musa grinned openly. Karim slapped the rail once in approval. Hadi only tapped his staff twice on the keystones, a quiet sound like punctuation. So the quiet faith departed without Sinbad, carrying onward its remaining goods and its weathered captain, leaving behind several bundles of paper, a chest of lamp oil, spare rope, and one younger merchant whose journey had changed shape in the warm basin of an overlooked harbor. The days that followed lengthened into a season of deep and quiet usefulness. Sinbad took up residence in the keeper's dwelling room Nafisa had helped restore. The reed matting on the floor smelled sweet and dry. Through the little shuttered window, he could see the lower lamp, and beyond it, a narrow cut of basin water turning from gray to gold at sunrise. His mornings began with water from the cistern, lamp trimming, inspection of the key, and entries in the ledger. Nafisa taught him the habit of checking the handrail along the middle path with his palm each dawn, for salt wind loosened things in ways the eye did not always catch. Imran and his kin came and went with fish and woven goods, and in exchange carried away cloth, jars, lamp oil, and news. Visiting coasters became regular enough that the harbor, no longer surprised at the sight of sail, yet infrequent enough that silence still lived easily between arrivals. The creatures continued their timeless pattern. Some evenings there were only 2 or 3 in the basin, servicing beyond the lower lamp's road of amber. Other nights, especially when the moon was broad and the warm current strong, Sinbad counted 7, 9, once even 12 dark backs, drifting and breathing, under the lantern glow. One vast, smooth elder, perhaps the same each time, though he could never be sure, favored the deeper western side and rolled there with such leisurely certainty that the water seemed to bend around it in affection. Young sailors from passing boats, when they saw these beings for the first time, invariably grew quiet. No order was needed. The basin itself taught them. With time, Sinbad's ledger became more than a record of supplies and repairs. It became a little book of attention. He noted when the warm current rose earliest. He recorded the first appearance of autumn haze along the outer shoals. He described how the high lantern's turning beam looked in mist, and which captains entered best when told to align the lower and middle lights first, then trust the upper sweep. He wrote down the names of vessels that behaved courteously in the basin, and those better directed elsewhere. He added trade notes as well. Plain wool welcomed, fine silk unnecessary, good ceramic water jars valuable, copper bowls useful, indigo less sought than oil and paper, dried lemons favored by island crews, shell lime to be carried carefully in damp weather. Such matters may seem small on grand maps, but they are the true weave of maritime life. The more he wrote, the more he understood that a harbor is partly built of paper, too. Not because paper holds stone upright, but because written memory resists the soft erasures of indifference. The season mellowed. Days became a little less fierce at noon. Evenings stretched longer. The sea outside the basin wore more pewter than blue. Small flocks of birds began using the little islands as resting points on their wider courses. One by one, bundles of goods accumulated in the store shed, according to use rather than accident. Nafisa's room gained a shelf for dry herbs and one for lamp cloths. The trough by the tamarisk shrubs held water again for pack animals, brought on rare trading boats. A low bench was repaired beside the quay, so old knees might rest while waiting for tide. Hadi remained through much of this, though age began to show more frankly in the way he lowered himself to sit, and in how long he lingered over the climb to the upper point. He did not mind. Age, in him, had become less a loss than a refinement. He spoke even less than before, but when he did, the words landed in Sinbad's mind, with the calm inevitability of soundings taken in clear water. One dusk, after a day spent setting a new iron pin in the middle lamp and tallying oil stores for the coming colder weeks, Sinbad climbed with Hadi to the upper lantern. The sea breeze had already awakened the turning frame, though the lamp was not yet lit. The sky was pearl near the horizon and deepening blue above. Below them, the lower and middle stations waited, each one a point of human readiness on the old stone. Hadi stood with one hand on the parapet wall and looked toward the basin. When men tell stories later, he said, they will speak perhaps of the creatures and make them larger than truth, or stranger. Probably, Sinbad said, they will speak perhaps of hidden warmth below the sea, and add marvel where plain mystery is enough. Sinbad smiled. Probably that too. Hadi turned his gaze to him. Then remember this, better than marvel. The harbor lived again because a few people accepted small duties and repeated them. That is the part storytellers often drop. I will not drop it. Good. They lit the upper lantern together, and the high turning light went out over the water with its old patient gesture. Not dazzling, not commanding, only showing that care had taken its place where neglect had once sat. Eventually, even Hadi prepared to leave. It was decided gently, not announced. Nafisa saw first that the old man tired sooner. Imran offered without being asked to carry his chart chest. Sinbad began taking more of the evening climbs. Hadi himself merely said one morning, while folding his cloak with unusual care, a harbor should not depend on one old conscience forever. He would sail north with a pottery coaster, whose captain valued quiet passengers and accurate coast talk. Before he left, he spent one final full day with Sinbad walking the whole line of Duha's Rest. Quay, cistern, lower lamp, middle path, upper point, store shed, basin edge. At each place he said little, but what he said entered the younger man's memory like pegs driven into seasoned wood. Never let the cistern cover go one season unrepaired. If oil runs low, extinguish the upper first only in the clearest weather, never the lower. Do not flatter captains. Tell them what the harbor can and cannot do. If trade swells too much, refuse what strains the basin. Write down the arrivals of the elders when you can. Old patterns may teach later eyes. At the quay near sunset, Hadi placed his hand briefly upon the post of the lower lamp. This is enough, he said. Not perfect, not complete. Enough. When the pottery coaster took him the next morning, the departure felt tender but not grievous. Hadi had never belonged to the harbor in the way Nafisa did, nor in the newer way Sinbad now did. He had come to return what he had once failed to protect. That done, he could go lightly. On the boat's stern he raised 2 fingers in farewell. Sinbad answered. Nafisa stood beside the cistern house with her shawl moving in the sea breeze. Then the vessel rounded the outer shoals and was gone. After Hadi's departure, Duha's Rest grew quieter still, yet not emptier. The old man's absence settled into the place as a form of trust. The harbor no longer needed his eye at every stone. His teachings moved through other hands now, through Sinbad's ledger, through Nafisa's practical memory, through Imran's growing competence on the path, through the daily tasks repeated until they seemed less like assignments and more like a natural breathing of the place. Weeks passed. The moon changed. The warm current varied. The elders came and went in patient number. A pair of young shellbacks appeared once at the edge of the basin, smaller than the others and brighter in their markings, and Nafisa smiled to see them. Then the old ones are not only ending, she said. That pleased Sinbad more than any cargo prophet might have done. He sent letters north by trusted captains to Basra, setting his accounts in order and explaining the season's change. To Faraj, care of the next port where the quiet faith would likely put in, with requests for lamp oil, plain cloth, paper, copper pins, and no large merchants with louder ambitions than courtesy. To 2 cautious captains he knew from earlier coastal work, inviting them, if they valued sheltered water, modest exchange, and silence after moonrise, to add Duha's rest to their ledgers under strict conditions of basin conduct. He wrote clearly. He wanted no confusion about the place. The answers that came back over time were heartening and calm. Faraj approved. One captain sent 3 skins of excellent oil and a bundle of fresh reed pens. Another sent horn panes wrapped in wool. A Basra trader, hearing Sinbad's description, offered fine silk on the next run and was politely refused in writing. Duha's rest needed rope, jars, plain cloth, pegs, and paper, not vanity. With each quiet decision, the harbor's character sharpened. By the time cool nights began to settle more deeply over the basin, the little place had found a rhythm so natural it seemed almost incredible that it had ever lain in neglect. Lamps were cleaned at dawn and lit at dusk. Visiting craft entered by guidance rather than guesswork. Water was drawn, counted, and covered. Goods came in modest, useful quantities and left the same way. The creatures rose under moonlight, ancient and untroubled. Children from Imran's island learned to carry oil carefully and to lower their voices near the basin after dark. Sinbad's ledger, now wrapped in cloth each night against damp, held a season's worth of breathing detail. One of the loveliest evenings of that first full season came under a moon so clear that the upper turning lantern seemed almost unnecessary, and yet beautiful for existing. 3 visiting vessels lay within the harbor then, a pottery coaster, a fish boat, and a narrow trader carrying paper and saffron. Their crews had eaten, washed bowls, and fallen into that gentle post-labor quiet common to men who trust their anchorage. No hammer sounded. No loud laughter crossed the water. The lower lamp burned amber. The middle glowed steady. The upper turned in calm sweeps over the outer shoals. Beneath that triple line, the elders rose one by one until the basin seemed full of breathing islands. Sinbad stood on the quay with Nafisa and watched the light move over shell and smooth wet skin. The oldest of the shell-backed creatures drifted nearest that night. Its head surfaced, ancient and mild, and remained above water long enough that the lamp's reflection rested in each dark eye like a tiny second moon. Nafisa said, "My mother used to call them the basin's memory." "It suits them," Sinbad answered. "She said a harbor kept in the presence of old creatures makes men behave better because they remember they arrived late." He smiled at that, and after a little while said, "Then perhaps all harbors need old creatures." Nafisa laughed softly. "Or at least old women to remind them." It was there, under that moon and before those immense patient beings, that Sinbad felt most fully the story of the place settle into him. Not as something to boast of later in market halls, not as a marvel to enlarge, but as a shaping of inner measure. He had come to Duha's rest as a merchant with good habits and a quiet curiosity. He remained as something slightly altered. Still a merchant, still practical, still attentive to goods and routes, yet less inclined to think that worth must announce itself. The harbor had taught him that small places, tended properly, can hold meanings larger than busy ports. The creatures had taught him that age without display may be the deepest kind of presence. Hadi had taught him that repentance can take the form of maintenance. Nafisa had taught him that memory lives in shelves, handrails, oil measures, and drainage channels as much as in charts. The basin had taught him to let usefulness and reverence stand together without crowding one another. Seasons would carry him onward after this, of course. He would not remain forever. A life at sea and shore rarely permits any one harbor to become the whole of a man. But he knew, as he watched the elders breathe under the light, that Duha's rest would never again become to him merely a point on a chart. It had entered the deeper ledger. When at last the time came, some weeks later, for him to sail north on a paper trader bound toward larger routes, the harbor did not feel as though it were losing him. That was the surest sign that it had truly revived. Nafisa remained. Imran remained. The lamps remained. The ledger remained, with copies ready to travel. The cistern held clear water. The quay welcomed patient craft. The elders rose by moonlight. A place dependent entirely on one person has not yet been restored. Duha's rest no longer depended. It lived. On his final evening there, Sinbad climbed alone to the upper point just before dusk. He lit the lantern, set the weighted cord, and watched the beam begin its slow turning over shoal and channel. Then he looked down. The lower lamp waited below like a steady heart. The middle station glowed with readiness. The quay held small, ordered things, coils of rope, stacked jars. A broom leaned by the store shed. The reed-matted threshold of the keeper's room. Nafisa moving toward the cistern with measured steps. Beyond, the basin darkened into its deeper, warm green. Somewhere under that surface, the oldest creatures of the place moved according to a wisdom. No ledger needed. One by one, as the dusk thickened, they surfaced. A domed back, another, a long, smooth rise, breath feathering in the cool air, circles widening and dissolving, the harbor light touching them and letting them go. Sinbad stood there until the stars began to show between the upper lantern's quiet sweeps, and then he descended the path slowly, his hand brushing the rail Nafisa had insisted upon, his feet finding the worn stones that generations before him had used for carrying oil through the dark. At the quay, he checked the lower flame, looked once more across the basin, and felt in his chest a peace so deep and calm it resembled anchorage after long drift. The next morning, he sailed, the vessel bearing him north, eased out by the guidance of the three lights now sleeping in dawn, by the darker channel line, by the memory already written into his hands and eyes. Nafisa stood on the quay. Imran raised one arm. The harbor shrank gently behind him, not into insignificance, but into rightful scale, a modest crescent of stone and lamp and basin, tucked among shoals and little islands, made durable again by patience, even after the point was lost from sight, and the outer sea had widened. He carried with him the sense of warm water, breathing under moonlight, and of great ancient forms rising without urgency beneath honest lamps. In later years, when ports grew louder and tales around him grew larger, he would still remember that quieter voyage before many of his more famous ones. He would remember the overlooked harbor, the old navigator, the keeper's daughter returned by rumor of a light. The ledgers, the oil measures, the handrail on the middle path, the basin rules copied from a cracked tablet, and the creatures older than time who had made every human act there feel smaller and more sacred at once. And often, in whatever harbor he found himself at dusk, if the water near the pier happened to warm unexpectedly under his fingers, or if an old shellback surfaced beyond the moorings with moonlight upon its back, he would fall still for a moment and listen inwardly for the hush of Duha's rest, the place where patience had burned again in 3 quiet lamps, and where the sea, the stone, the creatures, and the work of careful hands had taught him that the oldest wonders do not cry out to be noticed. They simply continue, breathing in their warm basin until someone gentle enough arrives to light a lamp beside them and keep it faithfully through the night. For several days after the little harbor disappeared behind the outer islands, Sinbad found that his thoughts moved with 2 tides at once. One was the ordinary tide of trade and travel, which asks after cargo, weather, water casks, temper of crew, and the neat keeping of promises made in one port to be fulfilled in another. The vessel carrying him north was a narrow paper trader called the White Heron, and it had its own rhythm, its own smells of reed bundles, lamp oil, carded wool, damp rope, and cedar pegs stacked in ordered shade. Its captain was a courteous man named Malik, who spoke rarely and liked his tea with mint and no sweetness. The days aboard were calm. The sea remained workable. The little islands of the southern coast drew away and gave place again to wider reaches of water and more familiar routes. Yet beneath that ordinary tide, another current moved, slower and warmer. It was the memory of Duha's arrest, breathing behind him like a second sea carried in the mind. At odd moments he would pause over the sound of water against the White Heron's hull and realize he was listening not only to the vessel under him, but to the basin's gentler wash beneath moonlight. He would lean to rinse his hands in a bucket and remember not the coolness of ordinary seawater, but the mild, tempered warmth that rose from beneath the harbor floor. He would smell lamp smoke on his sleeve and see again the 3 lights in their patient order: lower amber, middle steady, upper turning. He did not speak of the place very much. There are experiences that grow truer when not turned too quickly into conversation, he answered when Malik asked where he had delayed that season, and he described the harbor plainly, without embellishment. A neglected anchorage brought again into modest use, a cistern repaired, a line of lamps restored, a basin where old creatures surfaced at moonrise and where noise was kept low out of respect. Malik listened, nodded, and asked no foolish questions. "That sounds," he said at last, "like a place worth entering slowly." "It is," Sinbad answered. The White Heron made her way northward in measured stages. She stopped at 2 small coves and one busier port where pottery from inland came down in carts, and the smell of kiln dust mingled with sea salt. There Sinbad saw again what he had always known, and yet had begun to weigh differently: the noise of trade, the quick bargaining, the counting tables, The men who spoke of routes only in terms of gain and delay. None of it was false. Ships had to earn their passage. Crews had to be fed. Lamp oil did not arrive in harbors by piety alone. Yet he felt, moving among these ordinary labors, that another proportion had entered him. He no longer wished to ask only what a place yielded. He wanted also to know what it required in order to remain itself. Before he reached Basra again, he had already begun laying the next season's care into motion. At one port, he bought 2 broad-mouthed ceramic jars of the kind Nafisa preferred for clean oil storage, because their glazing ran evenly to the base, and they took less damp from the air. At another, he commissioned a bundle of plain cotton cloth, tightly woven but not fine, for lamp wrappings and cistern covers. He purchased also 3 coils of good rope, not thick mooring rope, but the smaller kind useful on paths and lantern mechanisms, and a packet of bronze pins from a smith whose work he trusted. He chose paper too, but not the costly polished kind meant for courts or wealthy correspondence. He chose sturdy reed paper that would take salt air if wrapped carefully and still hold ink without blotting. When at last Basra received him again, it did so with all its familiar river sounds and harbor motions. Barges crossed beneath pale morning mist. Porters called to one another in hoarse half-voices. Warehouse doors rolled wide. The smell of spice, mudbank reeds, dates, tar and wet timber returned around him like a garment he had once worn every day, and now noticed afresh. He went first, as duty required, to settle his accounts. Those days might have felt dry to another man after such a season, but Sinbad did not mind them. Ledgers had their own quiet beauty when kept honestly. He sat in the spice storeroom above the river, where light entered through a lattice and fell in patterned strips across the low table. There he sorted receipts, noted transferred cargo shares, recorded the goods he had left behind at Duha's rest, and balanced his own modest losses against what he knew was a truer gain. He wrote letters, too, one to Faraj, thanking him and asking after the quiet faith's southern run, one to Malik, though the captain had scarcely yet left the river, confirming future arrangements for small cargoes, one to a pottery merchant who supplied narrow-necked jars fit for water and oil, one to a rope maker in the upper quarter, whose work kept its twist even in damp sea air. And at the center of these ordinary transactions, he opened a new ledger, not his household ledger, nor his voyage account book, but a separate one, bound in plain leather with cedar boards at the covers. On the first page he wrote, in a careful, steady hand, account of the harbor of Duha's Rest, for oil, cloth, rope, jars, paper, pegs, repairs, and all modest goods needed to keep light, water, and quiet basin in honest order. He looked at the words a long moment after writing them. Then he closed the cover gently and set the ledger beside the old chart Hadi had given him. Through the weeks that followed, life in Basra moved around him with all its usual breadth. Yet he did not allow the harbor to soften into memory. He sent out inquiries among coasters likely to pass that region without burdening it. He refused 3 unsuitable proposals from larger merchants who, hearing of a revived anchorage, wished to use it for faster transfer of bulk goods. To each, he replied courteously and firmly that Duha's Rest was not a place for heavy warehousing or crowded traffic. It was a modest basin with limited water, quiet rules, and fragile balance. Those who wanted speed and volume could use louder ports elsewhere. One trader laughed at him for this, saying, "A harbor either grows or it dies." Sinbad answered, "Some harbors live by remaining the right size." That reply gave him more satisfaction than if he had won a sharp bargain. As the season turned and the heat softened, he heard from those who had passed near Duha's Rest, and their reports came in the way such reports always do, piecemeal and low-voiced at quayside or over cups of tea. The lamps had been seen from outside the shoals. A pottery coaster had taken water there and spoken well of the place. A fish boat claimed the basin still held its old warm current. A captain from the North Islands had seen broad, dark backs rising beyond the quay after moonrise, and had lowered his voice afterward without knowing quite why. These accounts heartened him, but they also stirred in him the steady wish to return before winter deepened too far. Harbors change by season. What is sound in warm months reveals other needs when colder winds begin to touch stone and lantern housing. He wanted to see whether the cistern cover held after the first real rain, whether the upper turning lantern still moved smoothly, and whether Nafisa had enough cloth, oil, and practical company. He wanted, too, though he said it to no one, to stand once more upon that quay at moonrise and hear the elders breathe in the basin. So before the cool season had fully settled, he booked passage not on a large vessel, but on a modest supply dhow whose captain he trusted to understand restraint. It was Faraj himself who arrived in Basra to make that voyage northward and then turn south again, the quiet Faith looking weathered by her longer circuit, but well kept. When Sinbad saw the familiar broad beam easing into the side quay, he felt not excitement exactly, but the calm gladness one feels at the approach of a boat rowed by a known hand over familiar water. Faraj came ashore with 2 fresh creases near his eyes from sun and wind, and accepted tea before speaking of business. "The South gave me resin, rope, and a contrary clerk," he said. "The clerk I did not bring you. The rest I did." "And Duha's Rest?" Sinbad asked. Faraj took his time answering, which was his way when he knew his words would matter. "Seen at distance only on my upward pass. 3 lights honest, 1 fishing craft within. No sign of trouble." That was enough to decide the matter completely. Together they arranged a cargo suited to the harbor. Lamp oil, but not too much for the storage shelves. Plain cloth, 2 bundles of sturdy paper, bronze pins, rope, 4 glazed water jars, a little tea for Nafisa, because Faraj said women who keep harbors also deserve flavor, a small chest of dried figs for Imran's family, cedar pegs, copper mesh for lantern vents, fresh wick, a replacement handbell of slightly finer tone than the first, if ever the old one cracked. And because Sinbad had learned how quickly little practical tools vanish into years, 3 careful brooms and a set of iron hooks for hanging wet gear clear of the floor. Nothing grand, everything necessary. The voyage southward felt slower than the northward one had, though the winds were no worse. That was simply the way of a return desired by the heart. The quiet faith moved from river into gulf, and along the coast's familiar long, low lines. Sinbad stood often at the rail in early morning, watching seabirds pass, and the water alter in color with depth. Voyage said little. They had known one another enough by then not to fill every silence. Rashid, cheerful to see him aboard again, produced one evening a dish of onions stewed with lentils and a little cinnamon, and remarked as if on weather, "A man returns more peacefully to a harbor he has repaired with his own hands." Sinbad smiled. "He does." The first sign of the southern island region came in the soft change of the sea, the same change he had noticed before. A mingling of brighter shallows and darker channels, a complexity under the surface that required patience from the eye. The second sign was the warmth in the water when drawn up in a rinsing bucket. The third was not the sight of the harbor itself, but of birds moving in broad, easy curves above one particular reach of darker basin water. By the time Duha's Rest came into view, late light had begun to soften the stones. The 3 lamps were not yet lit, but all 3 stations stood clearly against the evening sky. The lower post, neat and upright by the quay, the middle shelf tidy and held by its little wall, the upper turning lantern, still unlit, resting on the point with an air not of ruin but of duty, paused until dusk. Smoke rose from one of the dwellings. A fishing skiff lay pulled high near the quay edge. The cistern house roof showed fresh patching, and because the sea was calm, the quiet faith entered to the sound, not of hammering or confusion, but of low voices in water shifting under the hull. Nafisa was waiting on the quay. She had wrapped herself in a heavier blue shawl against the evening breeze, and her face, when she recognized both vessel and passenger, did not alter much at first. That was her way. But when Sinbad stepped ashore, and she placed one hand briefly against his forearm and said, "Good. The lamps have asked after you," it was perhaps the warmest greeting he had ever received. Imran came down from the middle path, carrying an oil jar on one shoulder. He had thickened a little in the chest, and moved with greater steadiness than before. Behind him came 2 boys from his island, cousins perhaps, each with the careful look of those newly trusted with meaningful tasks. Rashid's gift chest of figs was received as if it were a kingly treasure, though everyone pretended it was ordinary. Faraj oversaw the unloading with his usual discipline. The cargo was brought ashore in measured order and entered into Sinbad's harbor ledger before full dark. Oil by count, cloth by length, paper wrapped and placed high, bronze pins sealed in a jar, rope hung clear of damp, tea on the shelf inside Nafisa's room, with a soft sound of approval from her that might almost have been laughter. Then, as twilight deepened, they lit the lamps together. The lower lamp took first, as ever, amber and immediate. The middle followed steady from its shelf. The upper turning lantern came last, with Imran now tending the weighted cord under Nafisa's eye, and Sinbad checking the vent mesh and glass seams by habit. When the beam began its calm sweep over the outer shoals, Faraj looked up from the key and said only, "Still true." It was the sort of praise the harbor deserved. That night, the basin seemed fuller than when Sinbad had last seen it. Whether the elders truly came in greater number, or whether his absence had sharpened his eye to each one, he could not have said. But the dark domes rose and sank across the warm water with a solemn abundance that deepened the evening into something almost ceremonial without ever becoming spectacle. One old shell-backed creature drifted very near the line of the lower lamp. Another rolled beyond the middle reflection, and farther out, where the deeper warmth gathered, a broad, smooth elder surfaced in such silence that only the long, pale gleam left upon the water proved its passing. Faraj stayed only 2 nights, for the quiet faith still had her commerce. Yet in those 2 days he helped with the things a good captain notices immediately. A mooring ring that had begun to loosen in one keystone, a slight wear in the upper lantern cord, the need for one more weather lip on the middle housing before winter rains. Rashid mended a shelf hinge. Karim showed one of Imran's younger cousins how to splice small rope neatly so it would not snag in the dark. Musa, delighted to return even for so brief a stay, climbed the upper point twice to polish the horn panes, and once simply, Sinbad suspected, because he loved the view. When the quiet faith departed again, the leave-taking was simpler than the first time. The harbor now belonged to its own rhythm. Vessels might come and go, but the place did not seem to hold its breath over each departure. That steadiness comforted Sinbad. He had returned not to rescue a failing thing, but to re-enter a living one. He remained through the first of the colder weather. The changes were subtle, yet everywhere. The air sharpened slightly at dawn. The basin's warm current felt more distinct against the chill of outer water, and the lamp glass cooled faster after dawn extinguishing. The tamarisk shrubs rattled a little drier in the evening wind. The creatures rose later some nights, as though choosing carefully when the basin had gathered enough warmth beneath the moon. Winter on such a harbor was not harsh in the way northern places know, yet it asked its own quieter disciplines. Cloth had to be kept drier. Oil thickened slightly in the coolest hours and required gentler handling. Salt from sea spray built faster on the lower lamp housing when winds shifted. The cistern cover needed watching after the first true rain, and when that rain finally came, it came softly for half a day, steady enough to fill the little channels and bead on the keystones, gentle enough that no one hurried except to move paper and dry matting farther from the doorway. Sinbad loved that rain. He sat in the keeper's room with the shutter partly open and listened to water touch the harbor in all its different ways. The tap of drops from the eaves, the hush on the basin, the little sudden trickle into the west drainage channel, the soft drum on the patched cistern roof. Nafisa brewed tea with the leaves Faraj had brought, and a little mint from a dried bundle. Imran came in twice, smelling of rain and stone, to report that the middle path held well and the handrail remained firm. By afternoon, the rain had passed, leaving everything rinsed in silver. That evening, under a sky washed clear behind the storm, The elders came into the basin earlier than usual. Their dark forms rose through water that now steamed faintly in the cooling air. One old shellback surfaced so close to the quay that the rainwater still dripping from the stone made small rings around its broad head. Nafisa laid one hand lightly on the quay wall and whispered, "They like the fresh cool above the warmth below." The thought pleased Sinbad. It made the basin seem not merely inhabited, but chosen anew each season. With quieter weather came quieter visitors, a paper boat from the North Islands, a fisher pair carrying eels in wet baskets. Once, a narrow vessel bearing an old physician who asked to rest a night in the harbor because one of his joints pained him, and the warm basin air soothed him more than open coast. He paid not in coin, but by leaving a jar of salve for cracked hands, which Nafisa declared more useful than silver. The harbor taught again and again the value of modest exchange. One late afternoon, perhaps a month after Sinbad's return, another familiar sail appeared among the outer islands. It was not the quiet Faith this time, but a small coastwise boat with a patched tan sail and a stern painted long ago in faded green. It entered slowly under the lamps at dusk, and when the boat touched the quay, the passenger who stepped ashore was Hadi. He had grown thinner. The change was visible at once, though he still stood straight in that particular way older men sometimes do when they have long practiced dignity and no longer know another posture. His beard seemed whiter. The bones of his face showed more clearly, yet his eyes were unchanged, calm, exact, ocean quiet. Nafisa made a low sound of welcome and took his arm without fuss. Sinbad bowed his head, and Hadi rested one weathered hand briefly against his shoulder. "I thought," the old man said, "that I should like to see one more cool season here." No one asked how long he intended to stay. Some questions do not serve their hour. So Hadi remained for a little while. Those days were among the gentlest of all the harbor's restored life. The old navigator no longer climbed to the upper point daily, but from the quay and the middle shelf, he still saw what needed seeing. He sat wrapped in a heavier cloak near the lower lamp at dusk, and younger men, Imran, the cousins, even passing sailors, found themselves lowering their voices in his presence, not because he commanded it, but because quiet seemed more natural around him. He no longer carried charts often. Instead, he watched the basin, the lanterns, the arrivals, and the elders rising under moonlight, as if measuring not routes now, but continuities. One evening, Sinbad brought out the original chart Hadi had given him, now safely kept in Faraj's cedar box, and unrolled it beside the lamp. The parchment looked older in the winter air, more bronze than brown. The tiny lamp marks by Duha's rest had faded even further, but they were still there. Hadi placed one finger over them and smiled faintly. "Paper forgets slowly if loved," he said. "So do harbors," Sinbad answered. Hadi inclined his head. That night, after the lamps had been lit, and the basin lay full of warm, dark breathing, the elders rose in extraordinary calm. There was no wind at all. The upper-turning lantern moved only in its own weighted patience, Every reflection on the water seemed longer and more complete than usual. One shell-backed elder drifted near enough that its age-marked shell almost seemed another lamp's burnished dome, half sunk in the basin. A broad, smooth one surfaced beyond it, exhaled in a long silver breath, and rested there before sinking again. Heidi watched without speaking for so long that Sinbad wondered whether the old man had gone inward into memory. Then at last he said, "They were here before our roots, before our cargoes, before our errors and repairs. It is a comfort." "Yes," said Sinbad, "to know that not everything waits upon us." It was perhaps the deepest teaching Hadi ever gave him. The old navigator did not weaken dramatically. That would have been unlike the harbor and unlike the tale. Instead, he seemed simply to become quieter within his quietness. He slept more. He climbed less. He drank tea slowly in the morning with Nafisa and listened to Imran's accounts of weather and lamp oil, as if those simple reports were sufficient conversation for any wise man. Once he asked Sinbad to read aloud from the harbor ledger, not the practical figures only, but the little notations about the elders. 3 rose under early moon, warm current strong after rain, young shellback seen near west edge, no disturbance in basin. When Sinbad finished, Hadi closed his eyes briefly and said, "Good. Let the place be written as more than stone." By the close of that cool season, Duha's rest had become what perhaps it had always wanted to be in honest proportion. Not famous, not rich, not crowded, but dependable. A harbor with rules. A harbor with memory. A harbor where lights were kept for patient ships, and silence kept after moonrise for creatures older than charts. Sinbad knew then that his own staying need not be endless. The place no longer required his constant hands. His letters had established supply. His ledger could be copied. Nafisa remained. Imran had grown into trust. Even one of the younger cousins could now tend the lower lamp and recite the basin rules by heart. The final evening before his true departure came with a sky of deep, clear blue and one early evening star above the western edge of the islands. They shared a meal on the quay. Lentils, warm bread, olives, a little fish, and tea. Nothing ceremonial. The harbor disliked ceremony unless usefulness could wear it comfortably. Hadi sat wrapped in his cloak with the lower lamp behind him. Nafisa's shawl moved softly in the breeze. Imran spoke of a rope order from the North Islands. One of the boys carried the oil measure and filled the lower lamp under Sinbad's eye, with hands now steady enough to please them both. Then the lamps were lit in their accustomed order, and the basin opened itself to moonrise. Sinbad walked at last to the upper point alone. Below him the harbor glowed in its threefold line, the lower amber warmth close to stone, the middle lamp calm above the path, the upper turning beam in whose presence he stood, breathing slowly over shoal and channel and little island. Beyond, the basin darkened and then began, one by one, to reveal its ancient inhabitants. A shell-backed elder rose, then another. Then farther out the long, smooth back of one older still, or perhaps simply larger, and lay for a few breaths upon the water like a dark, polished hill under moonlight. Their coming no longer startled him. That was part of the blessing. Wonder had settled into companionship. He thought then, not sadly, not triumphantly, simply with a deep, settled clarity, that this was enough for a story. Not because everything had ended, but because it had found its true ongoing life. A harbor revived, lamps tended, creatures undisturbed. Knowledge passed from one hand to another. Trade kept modest and kind. Old guilt answered by repair. Younger eagerness gentled into stewardship. That was enough. When he descended, Hadi was still awake beside the lower lamp. The old man looked up as Sinbad approached, and for a moment the light touched both their faces the same way it had on the first night of the restored lamp, so long before, and when the basin had first accepted their return. "You will go tomorrow," Hadi said. "Yes." "And come again, now and then?" "Yes." The old man nodded. "Good. A harbor need not hold a man forever to teach him how to return properly." Sinbad sat beside him. For a time neither spoke. The elders breathed in the basin. The lamps burned. The keystones kept the day's last stored warmth. Somewhere behind them, Nafisa closed a door softly. Imran checked the middle path bell with one clear little note, and then let silence settle again. At length Hadi said very quietly, "You were wise enough to listen before your name grew loud. Keep that, if you can. I will try. That is enough." The moon rose higher. The upper turning lantern sent its patient beam over the outer shoals. The lower lamp held its amber road across the water. In the basin, beneath the gentle sweep of light, the creatures older than time continued their unhurried rising and sinking as they had long before men came with charts, and as they would long after ledgers closed and names softened. And there, in the warm-breathed harbor of Dua's Rest, with old stone beneath them and old water before them, the story came to its quiet shore, not with noise, not with finality sharpened into sorrow, but with the calm certainty of a lamp, well trimmed at dusk, a basin kept in reverence, and a path across uncertain water made trustworthy again for all who entered gently.